Hello and welcome to the House of Bavaria, a brief political history of the Bavarian Wittelsbachs. I want to start this presentation by asking the question, what is Bavaria compared to Germany? For those of you who don't recognize today's thumbnail, it is the Antiquarium Hall in the Munich residence. If you go to Munich, you'll discover that it's quite exceptional vis-a-vis other major German cities. It doesn't really feel in the center like a typical German city. To me, it has always felt very Florentine. Indeed, that's not by any accident that it feels that way. The Antiquarium is a Renaissance hall. It's one of the few of its kind outside of Italy, and it's the largest in Germany, if not the rest of the world. Indeed, the residence speaks to Bavaria's unique Italianate Roman Catholic culture. Compare that, and we have the other Bavarian idyll, Neuschwanstein, Ludwig the Mad's castle, the Alpine paradise. If you take this with the residence and the Roman Catholic connection, Neuschwanstein is actually part of Roman Bavaria. If France is to Gaul, it's almost fair to say that Bavaria is to the Roman province of Rhaetia. Neuschwanstein is near the town of Fussen, which the Romans was known as Phoetes, which was a prominent town on the Roman road to one Augusta Vindelicorum, which is now Augsburg in Bavarian Swabia, the state in which Neuschwanstein also resides, rather than Bavaria proper, to be very pedantic. And all this is referring to the identity of a cultural nation within Germany. When I was talking about the execution of Prussia, the references were almost always to the loss of East Elba, an identity of Prussia which was synonymous with vast landed estates, the Junker aristocracy, and Prussian militarism. Well, if there is a similar cultural nation for Bavaria, it is south of the Danube. It is Catholic Bavaria. It is the successor to the Roman Rhaetia. And just to underline this, especially this old identity that was seemingly fossilized during the middle of the 18th century, this is a brief description from Roderick Cavaliero's Ingenious Power and Magic. The Bavarians had something of the healthy vitality and directness of the peasant, unsophisticated, conservative, and traditionalist by nature. By and large, they were loyal, if rather oppressed. Roman Catholics living in a rich environment of gorgeous churches, with comforting and well-organized pilgrimages to numerous shrines, collecting alms and sustenance for well-endowed abbeys. They shared with the Austrians the Southerners' delight in pageantry and ritual. The drama of both was a constant pleasure, so that the delight that their lay and religious superiors took in the Baroque theatricalism of their palaces and churches was also that of the common man. The Baroque sensuality of the rhythm and tone entered their sense through the eye rather than the ear. And if you then take Wagner, it'll certainly also be through the ear. But look closer at Neuschwanstein, and you'll realize that it's an encapsulation of all of the contradictions of how the rest of the world understands the Swan King, which is Mad King Ludwig. And indeed, he is in some ways a broader reflection of his dynasty. Neuschwanstein forms a bit of a backdrop to Ludwig's obsession with Switzerland. He was obsessed with Schiller's William Tell, and also Switzerland provided the refuge for his hero, Richard Wagner. But Switzerland, of course, is not part of Germany and has traditions which are completely opposed to everything which I just read out from Cavaliero. If it is also to represent a mountain idyll, you can say it also represents a sense of Bavarian trauma, a trauma that so much of the Bavarian and German Alps was dispossessed in the preceding decades. However, Neuschwanstein is as much a German symbol as it is a Bavarian symbol. And those of you who are familiar with the unification of Germany will know that the construction of Neuschwanstein, which was a major source of financial woes for King Ludwig, was actually part of the impetus for the Kaiserbrief, the letter which the King of Bavaria sent to Bismarck to ensure the prince's loyalty in the foundation proclamation of the German Empire. In other words, Bismarck simply bribed Ludwig and cajoled him through the influence of his favorite Hornstein in order to get the funds necessary to pay for Neuschwanstein. So Neuschwanstein indirectly is responsible for German unification. With the loss of Tyrol, Bavaria was compensated with the territory of Franconia far to the north, making the whole territory of Bavaria, which we understand today, far more German as opposed to Alpine in its character. So, in many ways, Ludwig is a window to German nationalism, where he's known as the König, the king, and he's also a hero to Bavarian identity, to particularism, where he is known as Unsere König, our king. Both traditions seem to continue side by side. So we have Bavaria of the South Danube, Rhaetia, the cultural nation, and now we come to the dynastic nation, the nation of the four tribes. If you look at this map, you'll notice with the borders of the Kingdom of Bavaria superimposed that Bavaria is actually rather diverse, especially in the north, when it comes to language and religion. This is because much of what is now Bavaria was actually formed in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. In particular, if you see on the map on the right, there is a channel of Protestantism cutting through west of Franconia from the area around Bayreuth through to the city of Nuremberg. This is what is meant by the four tribes: Swabian, Franconian, Rhinelander, referring to this little territory you see on the left, the Palatinate, and of course, Bavaria. So by the time we get to the modern day, the 19th century and the 20th century, Bavaria has become rather distinct and seriously engorged from this cultural nation that we see. So how do we figure the Wittelsbach, the family of Bavaria, which have become so associated with it, with this territory? Well, Bavaria at its current borders, I see as inseparable from the legacy of the Wittelsbachs, because they were a dynasty that established a multi-confessional state, Catholics and Protestants, representing the union of two warring branches of the same dynasty, one in the Palatinate, which was Protestant, then Calvinist, and one in Bavaria, which was definitively Catholic. And both of these warring states, these warring parts of the family, would ultimately reconcile and become united through a succession struggle in 1779. Regardless of that, if you look at the map on the left, you will see that even after the integration of the quote-unquote Protestant Palatinate and Catholic Bavaria, the borders that you see on the right, which more or less mirror Bavaria today, have far more of these little pocket principalities in the north. And that is the result of the Napoleonic Wars. So already we have this fusion of several unique Wittelsbach traditions together. And it's because of the Wittelsbach legacy that Bavaria is a unique state or Länder within the German Federal Republic, because it is a dynastic state which has survived. It is a de facto one-party state, referring to the Christian Social Union, which has more or less dominated Bavarian politics since the inception of a new constitution following the American occupation. Really, the closest example of anything in Germany corresponding simply to having a dynastic state is Saxony, of the famous Wettin families, but that was basically suppressed during East Germany and was only re-established with reconfigured borders following the German unification. So there is nothing in Bavaria, nothing in Germany like Bavaria. Then there is the other angle, not simply looking at Bavaria in connection with Germany, but looking in Bavaria in connection with France. If you look at the image on the top, no, that isn't France, that isn't Versailles, that is in fact Herrenchiemsee, Ludwig's ode to Louis XIV of France, his desire to create an exact replica, including the Hall of Mirrors, along with a series of odes to the Sun King, and of course reflected to his own desire to be the Night King, or the Moon King, or whatever. But combined to this, Ludwig II was obsessed with French ritual. He wanted to recreate essentially an aesthetic of a French 17th century cult culture into 19th century new German Bavaria. If you look at the image on the bottom, you will see the new Schlesheim Palace, which has nothing to do with Ludwig. It was constructed in the latter part of the 17th century, and it took most of its form under the reign of the Elector Maximilian II. But it looks so convincingly French that Stanley Kubrick, in his Paths of Glory, decided to situate most of the film there. The accusation of all of this is not only is Bavaria seriously indebted not so much to German cultural influence, but to French cultural influence. An accusation, by the way, that could be hurled across any German state, including Prussia, especially with Frederick II, but that Bavaria is, as we understand it, a French creation. It is true that Bavaria possibly would never become a kingdom in its own right, in name at least, were it not for Napoleon. But if you look at the fact that its borders are actually not results of French gains, but losses to Austria and further compensations, the whole idea that France is responsible for creating Bavaria as is basically to afford the Wittelsbach, who have a history which is nearly as old as that of the Capetian dynasty in France, have very little, if no, historical agency. Rather, the Wittelsbachs are a European, world-spanning dynasty. They had an outcrop in Greece. One of the sons of King Ludwig I became Otto of Greece, a rather disastrous debacle out there. There was a brief contested reign of a Wittelsbach in Hungary in the 14th century. And in Scandinavia, not only was there a Wittelsbach king of Denmark and Norway, there were also a line of Wittelsbachs in Sweden. Charles XII, perhaps the most famous king of Sweden, apart from Gustavus Adolphus, were both, along with Ludwig II, male line descendants of King Ruprecht, all part of the same family. And this is also indicative of the fact that, as I've already mentioned, with the Palatinate and Bavaria, the Wittelsbachs had various principalities scattered across Germany. If you trace the lineage of the Hanoverian lines, which come to the royal family in England, and indeed the Jacobite lines, which formed a major royal in the 17th century, both these dynasties run through the Wittelsbachs. For much of its history, the Wittelsbach were the second dynasty. They were the second Catholic dynasty behind the Habsburgs, and they were the second German dynasty behind the Hohenzollerns. But Austria was severely dismembered, and what exists of Austria now is poorer than that of Bavaria, whereas Prussia was effectively executed, sentenced to die after the Second World War. And so out of all of these dynastic states, Austria, Prussia, and Bavaria, it is Bavaria that has survived more or less intact. And you can say, in a bizarre way, out of the great families, the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns, which have in many ways overshadowed that of the Wittelsbach, in a strange way, were the winners. So I want to begin with the pre-Wittelsbach Bavaria. How did the Wittelsbach come to the possession of the Bavarian duchy? Well, as I alluded to, there is the cultural nation. And you can see on this image in the middle, the Etonian Bavaria, which includes what was the previous possession of Roman Noricum, Carinthia, and Verona. In fact, looking at this map, it would actually be far more conducive to all of the images and the Roman arguments which I've just given you, that map instead served as the basis for Bavaria entirely, an Alpine kingdom straddling both Italy, Austria, and the region south of the Danube. But ultimately, that broke up very quickly after the foundation. It was a very loose confederation at that. So having started off its career as the province of Raetia, the Roman province of Raetia, the Roman Empire collapses, and we have the Ostrogothic kingdom that replaces it. And for the next 100 years following the fall of the Roman Empire, there are connections that are maintained between Italy and the south of Germany. It's only when we have Justinian's conquest in the 6th century and the settlement of a tribe, which Jordanus refers to as the Baiarios, which has later been essentially associated with the Bajuvari, Bavarian, although there's been another German etymology rendering of Baiarios, which is Bajuwaren or Bajuwaren. The idea is that this was not a typical ethnogenesis or a migratory tribe like we see with the Goths, like the Burgundians, like the Vandals, even the Franks, because all of these territories, especially even later tribes like the Magyars in Hungary or the Bulgarians, have this idea of a Heimat, in particular, an original homeland from which these tribes originally came from. If you look at Hungary and Bulgaria in particular, they had origins which are closer towards the Volga. Whereas it seems when it comes to Bavaria that we have an amalgamation of new settlers, Roman settlers, and other tribes like the Alamali, like the Rugi, and like the Langobards, which, given the fact that they go on and then form the basis of the medieval kingdom of Italy, is another Italian connection linking Bavaria to the territories below or above or beyond the mountains, ultramontane. After a brief conquest by the Frankish Merovingian dynasty, a ruler emerges called Garibaldi of the Agilolfings. According to one Gregory of Tours, this forms the first Bavarian dynasty, or the Old Bavarian Duchy, which lasts until Charlemagne conquers the region just before the year 800 when he's proclaimed emperor. Under this Charlemagne Carolingian influence, Bavaria had established its own legal code. There had been Christians in Bavaria before Bavaria came into existence, but the link with the Roman Catholic Church was renewed again in the 7th century, and by the 9th century, Bavaria was abounding in churches and monasteries, and there was the creation of Roman bishoprics such as Regensburg, Passau, Salzburg. So Bavaria was host to various semi-independent ecclesiastical principalities that would endure until the end of the Holy Roman Empire in the 19th century. And thus Bavaria was always a strong source of Catholic retrenchment. This Carolingian Bavaria, at many times you could say, began to resemble like a peripheral pseudo-kingdom. The only sort of thing you can really perceive of as having an analogy to Bavaria and the whole empire of Charlemagne is looking at something like Aquitaine, the region in the southwest of France that was never really under the control of the Franks. But it was during this time also that Bavaria only barely survived a series of invasions from the Hungarians. If you look at the Battle of Pressburg, for example, most of the Bavarian royal family, most of the Bavarian aristocracy were killed. But fortunately for Bavaria, the Bavarian state was reconsolidated under a duke known as Arnulf the Bad for various regions, which aren't actually that pertinent for this discussion, until his own dynasty, Arnulf the Bad's dynasty of the Leopoldings, passed finally to become part of the ruling dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottonian dynasty. And it's here I want to read a brief segment from Peter Wilson's The History of the Holy Roman Empire. Bavaria is identifiable from the mid-6th century as distinct from the eastern part of the former Roman province of Rhaetia, beyond the river Lech, north of the Alps and south of the Danube. The Bavarians resisted Frankish attacks, but they faced simultaneous pressure from the Avars in what is now Hungary to the east and were forced to submit in 788. The Avars, by the way, were the predecessors of the Hungarians. Bavaria remained politically distant from the king throughout the 9th and the 10th century, distant to the Carolingians. The Ottonians were careful not to combine Bavaria and Swabia under the same lord, who might block the Alpine routes to Italy. If you look at a map of Germany, perhaps it's instructive actually to go to these maps here, even though it's from a different time frame. If you look on the left, if you look at the Duchy of Württemberg and the Electorate of Bavaria, basically more or less corresponding to the old sort of boundaries of Swabia and Bavaria, unite those and consider the fact that the Holy Roman Empire as a state united both Italy, Eastern France, and Germany. Having any ruler hold on to that territory would have essentially cut off the lifeline between the various kingdoms of the Holy Roman Empire. Bavaria's eastward expansion was characterized by the creation of a succession of marcher lordships or militarized frontier regions. This is what you can see on this map in the middle. Like also established along the river Elbe. By that he's referring to the beginning of conquest against the Slavs. So the establishment of Saxony and Thuringia in particular was seen as the frontier of what was then essentially the Germanic world. And it's only in the 12th century, 200 years later, that the Germans really begin to push against the Slavs and annex territory up to the river Oder, which is the modern boundary of Eastern Germany. The Ottonians used the opportunity of a victory over a Bavarian rebellion in 976 to separate these eastern marches, or Osterlici, which eventually became Austria. Simultaneously, the southern Alpine region was attached as the March of Verona, neutralizing the chances of Bavarian laws extending their influence into Italy. These moves effectively ended earlier possibilities that Bavaria might emerge as a distinct subkingdom in the manner of Bohemia. What Wilson is really referring to here is that early Bavaria as a tribal duchy was so prominent to the Etonians and the Carolingians that preceded them that there was a possibility that it could have been one of the constituent kingdoms of Europe and the constituent kingdom of the Holy Roman Empire. For reference, in the Holy Roman Empire, there was the Kingdom of Germany, there was the Kingdom of Italy, there was the Kingdom of Burgundy, and there was the Kingdom of Bohemia, which began to consolidate around the 12th century. So the idea is that Bavaria, by this time, by the beginning of the second millennium, had everything in the making to become one of the most important, significant territories of not just the Holy Roman Empire, but Europe. Indeed, had a Bavarian identity been fostered earlier, had it consolidated into a recognized, legally distinct kingdom, then it's very possible that Bavaria would become even more distinct from the rest of Germany. In a way, say, for example, Bohemia is, even though we're talking about Slavs versus Germanics. It's a great what if in medieval history. So following on from the Etonians, we had the Salian dynasty, which invariably also hold control of Bavaria. You have a brief interlude from a dynasty known as Nordheim, and finally a dynasty known as the Welfs, under their famous leader, Henry the Lion. This was a period of great confusion and civil war, especially in Bavaria in general, and Bavaria being on the crossroads with Italy. Henry the Lion is ultimately the figure who founds Munich 30 years before the foundation of Wittelsbach, Bavaria in the 1150s. But because of his constant wars and rebellions against the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, he was dispossessed of the duchy. And so it became the question of who to award the duchy to. The Welfs, which is the etymology, the origin for the medieval Guelph faction against the Ghibellines, were replaced by the Wittelsbach dynasty. And they were loyal to the Hohenstaufens, even under the threat of the Pope's ire and the threat of excommunication. One Count Palatine Otto the Redhead was a fierce partisan of Frederick Barbarossa's court, escorting the emperor to his coronation in Rome in 1155. In a legendary confrontation at a diet in Besançon, that's in modern-day France and Burgundy, an overzealous Count Otto was prevented from striking a papal legate only through the emperor's personal intercession. Such loyalty was finally rewarded in 1180 when Count Otto was given Henry the Lion's confiscated duchy. But he was perceived within Bavaria as an upstart and an imperial lackey. His precipitous death, only 3 years later, could have spelt the demise of this Bavarian house of Wittelsbach before it had really begun. He was replaced as Duke by his 10-year-old son Ludwig. And it was during this time that Frederick Barbarossa, the former patron of the Wittelsbach, takes the opportunity to seize various Bavarian contested territories. And in turn, this precipitates another disaster for Bavaria, as the emperor is seen as a great sort of expansionist into Germany, as he's accused of imperial overreach. It causes a counterattack by the soon-to-be first king of Bohemia, Ottokar I. So Bavaria, which Ludwig inherits in the 1180s, is a war zone. And what makes it even more unstable is that Ludwig's nominal protector, the emperor, dies shortly later on crusade in 1191. Ludwig attempts to form a new alliance with the new emperor, Henry VI, who again dies before preparing to embark on another crusade just a few years later. So everything again would seem to indicate disaster for the early Wittelsbach dynasty. So it's during the next couple of decades, from 1197 onwards, that Ludwig I carefully navigates the constant struggles that we see in Germany over who the Holy Roman Emperor is going to be. This is during the minority of the later famous Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II Stupamundi. But at this time, Ludwig cannot rely on the emperor for support. He's still too young. So he makes an alliance with his erstwhile enemy, the daughter of the king Ottokar of Bohemia, Ludmilla, thereby seriously increasing the rank and prestige of the Wittelsbach dynasty. He temporarily aligns himself with the dynasty which he had just dispossessed in Bavaria, the Welfs, who had created one of their members, King Otto IV, in opposition to the Hohenstaufens. And in that position, he was able to acquire the territory of the Palatinate on the left bank of the Rhine before siding once again definitively with the Hohenstaufens, attending Frederick II's coronation. Ludwig had consolidated his loose grip over Bavaria and acquired the Palatinate. Both of these territories would remain with the Wittelsbach dynasty until the end of the First World War. Ludwig would later go on crusade and become embroiled in a dispute with the emperor, his erstwhile ally, which was the probable cause for Ludwig's assassination in 1231. Nevertheless, when he was succeeded by Otto II, the dynasty was now in a much stronger position than it had been some 50 years before. Otto resumed his alliance with the Hohenstaufens and gained some prosperous territories, such as the territory of Bogen, while he fashioned the iconic blue and white lozenge as the heraldic device of the Wittelsbach family. It was here that the Wittelsbachs married into the imperial family itself. Otto became grandfather to the last Hohenstaufen king, Conraden. The two sons of Otto II, Ludwig, who would later be known as the Strict, and Henry, first ruled jointly, before partitioning Bavaria and the Palatinate between them, the beginning of a disastrous trend which will continue for the next 250 years. For context, in Germany, they have a strict definition of Salic law at this time. Not only do we have only male succession, but we have only male succession through the male line. Whereas elsewhere, in France at that time, before the introduction of Salic law in the 14th century, really, England, Spain and other countries, female succession was far more common, and you had many feudal domains that were held by women outright. But not only did you have absolute male succession in Germany, but an extension of Salic law was the partible succession. Many dynasties collapsed as a result of having too many sons. If you look at the Merovingian dynasty, which had played a part in the formation of Bavaria, it collapsed in part due to constant dynastic devolution. The Carolingians divided their territory, and ultimately that spelled the demise of the dynasty and the rise of new dynasties, the Capetians in France and Henry the Fowler and the Ottonians in Germany. These dynasties, the Capetians and the Ottonians, were far more successful in keeping these territories together, but Bavaria was very susceptible to this whole aspect of the partible succession. It's something that would not be resolved, you can say, in Bavaria until the 16th century, and taking Bavaria and the Palatinate not until the end of the 18th century. Louis the Strict, in his conflict in Germany against the various imperial houses, supported his nephew, the Hohenstaufen Conraden, when the latter was executed in one of the most dubious moments in medieval and indeed papal history. And Ludwig's stalwart adherence to the cause of the Hohenstaufens actually leads to his own excommunication. It's here that the Wittelsbachs begin their alliance with a nascent House of Habsburg and they unite against a common nemesis, Bohemia, under the expansionist king Ottokar II, the beginning of an incredibly complicated relationship between the two families, which have now been thrust into the heart of high German politics. As you can probably tell, Bavaria was in many ways a poisoned chalice, but almost inexplicably, the Wittelsbach dynasty of Bavaria went on to survive for 730 years, though at first in a severely truncated and mangled Bavaria. And this is coming back to Wilson, Peter Wilson, on the history of the Bavarian partitions. Bavaria since 1180 had been held by the Wittelsbachs, who originated as the Counts of Schweren in the 11th century and took the name from their new castle southwest of Pfaffenhofen in 1115. This is a custom which is endemic when it comes to various dynasties. The Hohenzollerns have Hohenzollern Castle, the Habsburgs have their Habsburg Castle in what used to be called Further Austria, which is now part of Switzerland. Even the Windsors when creating a new dynastic name for the British royal family, decided to take the name of Windsor in terms of this Germanic influence of a castle giving the family name, and such was the case with the Wittelsbachs in the 12th century taking the name. Their influence, the Wittelsbachs, really began only when they acquired the more prestigious county Palatine on the Rhine in 1214, and they saw themselves as the Hohenstaufens' natural successors after 1250. Given the connection between the family and how the Wittelsbachs had been such zealous partisans, and really that was the origin of the dynasty, you could perhaps see why they thought of themselves as the natural successors to become rulers over Germany and indeed the Holy Roman Empire. However, the family provides another illustration of how territorialization and dynasticism were not planned out or desired historical outcomes. Bavaria was partitioned into upper and lower duchies in 1255, this after the death of Otto II, to accommodate two brother heirs. Both lines experienced further splits before a brief unification from 1340 until 1349, with renewed partition only being resolved through a bloody inheritance dispute in 1504. Bavaria and the Palatinate were held combined until 1317, when a separate Palatine-Wittelsbach line had emerged before itself splitting four ways in 1410. Further partitions followed a brief reunion between 1449 and 1470. Bavaria and the Palatinate were not recombined until 1779, with a final reunification of all other possessions taking place over the next 20 years. The brief interruption in terms of this dynastic disunion is resolved by none other than Ludwig IV, the Bavarian. Per Ludwig the Strict's dynastic policy, the Wittelsbach and the Habsburg families were joined. The soon-to-be Bavarian emperor grew up alongside his soon-to-be rival, King Frederick. But this policy of uniting the houses of Wittelsbach and the House of Habsburg, two families which both were seen as loyalists to the Hohenstaufens, which had now collapsed. Their duchy in Swabia had also disintegrated. Both these families were pretensions as successors for ruling over Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, perhaps inevitably fight over that legacy and form a dynastic rift that really isn't resolved until the 19th century. So this policy of linking the dynasties was shattered over a series of succession disputes, the Habsburgs and Austria trying to intervene to prop up one Bavarian candidate over another against Ludwig IV, who will emerge as the most powerful of the Wittelsbach Bavarian rulers. And this comes to a head with the battle between the Wittelsbachs and the Habsburgs at the Battle of Gamelsdorf in 1314. This young Ludwig became a compromise candidate to become Holy Roman Emperor amidst a dynastic struggle involving the Habsburgs, but also the House of Luxembourg. The House of Luxembourg had risen to prominence alongside the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbachs. And significantly, the Luxembourgs have been able to elect one of their own to be Holy Roman Emperor. This was Henry VII, who Dante, if not idolized, certainly supported, led an invasion into Italy, was crowned, and then was rumored to be poisoned soon after, which led to a long interregnum in which the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbach families are now competing for influence after the death of the emperor, almost inexplicably. The Bavarians in this contest under Ludwig win another battle against the Habsburgs, this time at the Battle of Mulhdorf. But this crisis, this war between the two houses of Wittelsbach and Habsburg, is only resolved when an agreement was finally reached that the Wittelsbach and Habsburg claimants, Ludwig IV and Frederick the Fair, would rule over the Holy Roman Empire jointly, something that was virtually unprecedented and hasn't occurred since. So what was the reasoning for this coming from the Bavarians? Well, in the process of imperial elections, the popes regularly got involved. Not only did emperors routinely pick anti-popes to oppose reigning popes, but in some cases, popes would pick anti-kings in the Holy Roman Empire to oppose a reigning king of the Romans or Holy Roman Empire. So one theory that's been put forward is that Ludwig IV, wanting to unite the Holy Roman Empire and establish, you can say, the independence of the emperor vis-a-vis the popes, wanted to prevent the Pope pitting these two forces against each other by aligning themselves with each other. This was also, you can say, an attempt to finally make peace and placate all of the Habsburgs, not just his now co-king of the Romans, Frederick the Fair, in particular Frederick's brother, Leopold of Austria. But it's also a time where we see a series of drastic political actions taken by Ludwig IV, which really present him as one of the most ambitious rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, if not most ambitious rulers of his day. In 1323, the ancient dynasty that ruled over Brandenburg, the dynasty that the land that would later give rise to the Hohenzollerns, who would later become kings of Prussia, these being the Ascanian dynasty, died out. And so drastically, Ludwig escates the territory. By that, there is a vacant territory without a clear heir. The emperor claims it and then awards it to one of his sons, thereby establishing a Wittelsbach in Brandenburg. And had that lasted again, could have been a major, had a major effect on German unification going forward. In 1328, Ludwig invades Italy. You can call it a Italian Zug, you can call it a Italian journey, or you can call it an invasion, whatever. There's a very dubious coronation. One of the members of the Colonna family presenting himself as a captain and defender of the city of Rome alongside a cardinal officiates over the coronation of the Holy Roman Empire, while the Pope, of course, is based at this time in Avignon. But it allows for Ludwig again to try and establish his own Roman anti-pope. So he has a marked influence in Italy. He then comes back, and in northern Italy, on his return to Germany at the Treaty of Pavia, he finally attempts to resolve all of these partitions created between the Bavarian and Palatinate branches of the family, which will eventually resolve themselves, only to redouble upon his death. In terms of trying to establish the Holy Roman Empire as a hereditary possession, for further context, the Ottonians and the Salian dynasties were able to establish the principle of dynastic succession. Because the Hohenstaufens had constantly been at war with the papacy, the issue with dynastic succession for them was more dubious. But when the Hohenstaufens were quite literally annihilated in the end of the 13th century, and you had the rise of these three major rival dynasties, the Wittelsbachs, the Habsburgs, and the Luxembourgs, it simply became a matter of controlling a number of important princes in the Holy Roman Empire who would generally evolve into becoming what we'd later see in the early modern period, especially the period in later medieval Germany after the 14th century, as the electorates. But all of these rulers wanted to re-establish this idea of a hereditary succession. And so Ludwig attempts to make one of his cousins the king of the Romans, not only to placate other members of his family, but also to prevent anyone else from possibly aspiring to succeed him, any other member of any other family. Then we have Ludwig's, you can say, grandiose policy in the Hundred Years' War and policy towards France. From the outset of the Hundred Years' War, he supports the English, he supports the Plantagenet claim. He even attempts to go into the south of France and establish a defunct ancient kingdom, one of those kingdoms I mentioned before, Burgundy. In this period, it became known as the Arlat because it was Burgundy associated with the city of Arles around the city of Avignon. Not only would this have been a major sort of power play vis-a-vis France, but it would also be a major power play vis-a-vis the papacy, because Avignon, of course, would have been surrounded by this new kingdom of Burgundy in the south, in Provence and the Dauphin in the Arlat. But nevertheless, despite these grand plans laid by the emperor, nothing ultimately came of it. But in 1340, as Wilson has already alluded to, there is finally that moment of Bavarian reconsolidation. Bavaria is reunited, and not only is Bavaria reunited, but Ludwig attempts to expand the continuous territory of Bavaria by conquering the Tyrol a couple of years later in 1342. And in perhaps his most ambitious gambit, in 1345, he attempts to make his wife, the Empress Margaret of Hainaut, the ruler of the Low Countries, by awarding her the county of Holland and Zealand. And for those of you who are more familiar again with your later European history, it is this Wittelsbach creation of an inheritance over the Low Countries in the 14th century that will ultimately provide the impetus for Philip the Good and the Burgundians inheriting those territories and uniting it to their own territories in France. In other words, if there is, say, for example, an origin of the Spanish Netherlands and later the Austrian Netherlands, it actually begins in the 15th century with Ludwig's attempt to create a Wittelsbach or Bavarian Netherlands. So by 1346, you can say that the Wittelsbachs had reached a point of medieval ascendancy. Indeed, had these policies been more enduring, in other words, had they worked, it's possible that the Wittelsbachs would have come to completely eclipse the Habsburgs. But this was not to be. The aggressive expansionism of the emperor had so alienated the Luxembourg family, which of course had preceded him as Holy Roman Emperor with Henry VII, that they rose up Charles IV in opposition to him. Many of the German princes who were disaffected with Ludwig the Bavarian decided to support this upstart emperor. And in 1347, the entire inheritance begins to collapse. And it's really Charles IV, King of Bohemia of the House of Luxembourg, that puts the final nail in the coffin for Ludwig's grandiose legacy. Ludwig had 6 sons, and so a couple of years after his death, Bavaria is repartitioned, and we see the definitive split of the various Wittelsbach branches. In 1356, there is this process towards rationalization of what I had already mentioned regarding the move away from hereditary inheritance of the Holy Roman Empire and towards an elected emperor as a result of various prominent officials in the empire, prominent bishops and rulers being given the right to elect an emperor. 7 of these were created. One of them was given to the Palatinate, in other words, the junior branch of the Wittelsbachs, and Bavaria was rather infamously snubbed alongside Austria as well under the Habsburgs. So the Luxembourgers had basically established a new constitution, a new legal system for electing the Holy Roman Emperors that did its best to completely marginalize and break the powers of the rival houses. And to make it worse, one of the provisions of this treaty was that these electorates couldn't be dissolved. They couldn't be partitioned into various territories. The reason being is that if these territories were partitioned, then you would have various brothers claiming that they were the elector of this and they were the elector of that. So better to have 7 permanent electors. But because Charles IV of Bohemia granted the electorship to the Palatinate, the smaller German possession of the Wittelsbachs, and not Bavaria, it meant Bavaria could continue to disintegrate while the relatively unimportant Palatinate survived. So the partitions went through a series of phases. In 1392, we finally arrive at a quote-unquote stable 4-fold division of Bavaria into 4 units: Straubing, Ingolstadt, Landshut, and Munich. And it was not obvious which of these Bavarian partition states would survive. Straubing was initially the richest of all of these Bavarian territories because they were the family connected to Holland. But as mentioned, in Germany under Salic law, you had strict male inheritance. And so when the male line in the Straubing family failed, not only did they lose Holland, but the territory became partitioned by the remaining members of the Wittelsbach family in Bavaria. Landshut came to extreme wealth and prominence under one of their dukes, Ludwig IX, who was known simply as the Rich, along with his son Henry, and they incorporated the other German partition of Ingolstadt by 1447. So by 1447, there were only 2 divisions of Bavaria left. In 1460, Albert III of the Munich division of Bavaria died and was succeeded by 3 sons. John IV first inherited Munich, but this was following his short death, by the joint rule of the brothers Sigismund and Albert IV, the Magnanimous. or also known as the Wise. Albert had been destined for a career in the church, but John's unexpected death precipitated yet another partition between these two brothers, Bavaria Munich and Bavaria Dachau, albeit despite the fact that Albert was the younger brother, he being the far more capable of the two was actually awarded the more prominent position in Munich over Dachau. By 1487, after a couple of decades in power, Albert was pursuing an ambitious policy against the Habsburgs. His opponent was none other than the Emperor Frederick III, also known as the arch sleepyhead of the Holy Roman Empire. And during his conflict against the arch sleepyhead, Albert annexed valuable territories, such as the city of Regensburg, while also feigning that for every acquisition he made, he was simply creating a dowry which he was going to inherit from his future wife, and that future wife was going to be the emperor's own daughter, Kunigunde, who ultimately married Albert without the emperor's consent. This was a very ambitious and you can say deceitful policy, and it formed a coalition against him by not just the emperor, but a whole series of Swabian city leagues and princes. So when he attempted to acquire further Austria, that being the areas held by the Habsburgs that connected parts of Switzerland and Swabia to the Tyrol, such was the furor from the Habsburgs that he was forced to renounce any claims he had on this territory. So despite all of these reversals, in 1503, finally, the Landshut branch of the Bavarian Wittelsbach died out, and there was a bloody war of succession between Albert and his cousin, the Elector Philip of the Palatinate. Albert ultimately won that conflict after 2 years, but he was forced to concede to the creation of a new branch of the dynasty in Neuburg, northern Bavaria, and to give up territories in what remained of the Bavarian Tyrol, the territory around the little towns of Kufstein, which are now part of Austria. And this was apparently because the emperor had mediated the conflict. He deserved to be compensated with these territories. This was not a complete victory for Albert, of course, as I've been at pains to point out. Like his predecessor, Emperor Ludwig the Bavarian, he was an incredibly ambitious ruler, but Albert had united all of the main Bavarian divisions, and he succeeded in something that the Emperor Ludwig had failed drastically, which was that he decreed primogeniture, the everlasting succession, and thereafter Bavaria was consolidated into a single state with Munich as its capital, and thereafter Munich became known as the Wittelsbach capital. When you look at the cities of Germany today, you look at the main three cities, Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. Berlin, of course, started its career as a Hohenzollern city, but it very quickly had a German identity, completely eclipsed that of the dynastic legacy of the city, especially in the 20th century. Hamburg, of course, had no dynastic city. It was a Hanseatic League city and it was a republic. So Munich, you can say, is the only, not only regional capital, but it's perhaps the only dynastic capital that perhaps survives into the modern day. And it is as a result of the consolidation of a Duchy of Bavaria around Albert at the beginning of the 16th century. So there's really no way of quantifying Albert's achievement in reversing so much in the way of, you could almost see terminal decline. It can be argued that, as we see with so many other German dynasties, that Bavaria could have simply disintegrated, like we see with the Ernestine and Albertine branches of the Wettin family, which split off into Thuringia and Eastern Saxony. The houses of Brunswick, which also broke off, and even members of the family of Hesse. But in Bavaria, they were finally able to establish some form of unity, which, as it turned out, would happen to be in one of the largest and wealthiest corners in Germany. But nevertheless, Albert's second son, Ludwig, because he was born before the quote-unquote everlasting succession decree, argued, and would argue successfully, that he had the right to co-rule in Bavaria whilst residing in the second Bavarian capital of Landshut, but this was the last ever instance of co-rulership and the threatening of partition. During the 16th century, Bavaria, first under its Duke Wilhelm IV, was one of the few remaining princely bastions of Roman Catholicism, though William is perhaps better known for his Reinheitsgebot, regulating the purity of German beer. The Reinheitsgebot formed such a significant aspect of Bavarian identity and history that it was actually one of the few legal powers that was explicitly reserved to the Bavarian kingdom following German unification in 1871. But in particular, I'm fascinated with William because he was the one who patronized Altdorfer's Battle of Issus, which is now in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, and you can see it in the center here. If you want to understand more about the significance of this painting, it performed, you can say, the most, alongside Critique and Crisis, the most famous aspects, in not just in German, but in English, of Reinhard Koselleck's own conceptual take on history. And my video talking about the prophecy of Daniel discusses a lot about Koselleck's views on the Battle of Issus. So it goes without saying that the Bavarian rulership at this time, the Wittelsbachs, were legendary patrons of the arts. It's during this time that we see the full construction of the Munich residence with its Florentine facade, and of course the creation of the Antiquarium, this brilliant Renaissance Italianate palace in the center of southern Germany. Indeed, the extravagance and the artistic patronage of the Wittelsbach reaches a peak under Albert V in the so-called Landshaft quarrel, where the expenses are so extravagant, there's actually a noble coalition formed to rein in the Duke's spending. But from 1524, Duke William had become a close ally of Pope Clement VII. And in that same year, Thomas Cranmer, who would later become the first Protestant Archbishop of Cranmer, said, "Munich is the German Rome." Catholic Bavaria was mostly insulated from the brutal peasants' war between the radical and moderate reformers in southern Germany. And by that, I mean essentially that on the radical reformers, you have the Anabaptists and you have people like Munzer. And on the moderate reformers, you have figures like Luther, who were explicitly anti the peasants in this conflict. And by brutal, I mean this resulted in the deaths of as many as 100,000 peasants in Germany. It was a major consolidation of the Protestant princes in Swabia and Franconia. But Bavaria, because it was relatively unaffected and remained Catholic in 1524, was in a position to send an expeditionary force to prop up its neighbors, in particular the Catholic Archbishop of Salzburg. Much of this zealous Catholic policy can be attributed to Leonard von Eck, the de facto ruler of Bavaria until 1550, coming into power around the same time as the Field of the Cloth of Gold, so around the time of 1519, 1520. Leonard von Eck was responsible for translating a correction Bible against Martin Luther, and he did so in the Bavarian dialect, perhaps again in terms of actually fighting Luther in the war of the German vernacular and translating and also transmitting the Bible through the Gutenberg press. It became necessary for figures like Leonard von Eck in fighting the press war against Protestantism to actually follow the Protestant lead and translate Bibles into the vernacular, at least when it comes to educated circles who aren't so, again, proficient in Latin, that you have a Protestant definition of the Bible, and there is the Bavarian counter Bible to it. Indeed, it's under Eck's influence that, and you can perhaps say the experience of Bavaria from the Peasants' War, which enshrines this Catholicism in Bavaria. And this is in complete contrast to what we have with the other branch of the Wittelsbachs in the Palatinate. Under their elector Wolfgang, the family switched over to Protestantism and then Calvinism under the zealous Frederick III. It should be mentioned again, just for clarification, after the Golden Bull of 1356, I've left mainly the story of the Palatinate electors of the Wittelsbach family. as I will with figures like the Swedish Habsburg, the Swedish Wittelsbachs, simply for the sake that this is a Bavaria-centric conversation. And if you understand how many partible inheritances there were for the Wittelsbachs, you'll understand my my aversion in trying to chronicle entire history of the dynasty with so many competing branches and leaders. Hence why I also haven't gone into all of the leaders of the various German partitions of Bavaria by name. The Bavarian Catholic anti-Reformation posture still conflicted with the older dynastic posture towards the Habsburgs, as William IV and later Ludwig pressed a Wittelsbach claim to become kings of Bohemia. So for reference to this, there was the Battle of Mohacs. The king of Hungary and Bohemia was killed by the Turks under Suleiman the Magnificent, and Ferdinand of Austria, the younger brother of the Emperor Charles V of Habsburg, claimed the thrones of Hungary and Bohemia, starting a series, you can say, of crises in Bohemia that won't be resolved until a big bloody battle in 1620, the Battle of the White Mountain. But the Wittelsbachs, again being connected to the Bavarian dynasty and indeed the Habsburg dynasty, believe they're in a position to claim Bohemia. You can say in many ways it actually led to a Cold War that lasted for 10 years. And it was only with a realignment of the Bavarian Wittelsbachs with Charles V in prosecuting a war against the Protestants, who aligned themselves into something called the Schmalkaldic League, that peace was maintained, another alliance was created, and another marriage pact agreed. Here we come to William V, Wilhelm V, the pious Jesuit Duke. Under Wilhelm V, Bavaria was a center of the Tridentine reform. The Duke supervised the Bavarian clergy and the various Bavarian ministries through the Geistlicherat, or the Ecclesiastical Council. Catholic orders and education were patronized by the Wittelsbachs. In particular, Wilhelm patronized the Jesuit Wilhelminium, which is basically the Jesuit training college, and of course Wilhelminium, in reference to the Duke who founded it. He was also responsible for the creation of the great burial crypt of the Wittelsbach electors in St. Michael's Church in Munich. After 1555, the Holy Roman Empire being bound by something called the Treaty of Augsburg, effectively the Catholics lost the war to impose Catholicism back on all the princes. And so a compromise was reached by which the Catholics, so long as they ruled in their territory, were free to Catholicize and ensure one religion in their own territory. And the quid pro quo, the Protestants could achieve the same. It was with this principle, whose domain, his religion, that Wilhelm V was able to enforce Catholicism rigidly. In other words, to have Bavarian identity, to have residency in Bavaria, could only be confirmed by belonging to the Catholic Church. Many of the historians reading about this that I've encountered refer to William as bigoted or reactionary, mirroring similar popular charges which are labelled against Emperor Ferdinand II during the 30 Years' War. But it's obvious that Wilhelm's religiosity was genuine. It even precipitated his own abdication in order that he leave a contemplative life for the remaining 30 years of his existence, from, was it 1597 up until his death in 1626, well into the 30 Years' War. Wilhelm had effectively consolidated Catholicism in Bavaria. In many ways, he made it irrepressible when it came to the Protestant cause. In response to it, he lavishly patronized missionary works, not just in Europe. The Jesuit order had already been welcomed into Bavaria in 1541, but he made it part of Bavarian culture. Indeed, the Jesuits were patronized by Bavaria in Japan, in China, and indeed the Indies. The Bavarian territory that then passed on to his son, Maximilian the Great, as he is also known, was one of, if not the best governed regions in Germany. Now it's important to understand the part of the origins of the 30 Years' War as it pertains to the Wittelsbach dynasty, because you can look at a major running theme throughout the 30 Years' War is that it was a family civil war. It was a civil war between the Palatinate and the Bavarian branches of the family. As I'm being at pains to say, such conflict between the two branches of the family wasn't anything new. I mean, there had only relatively recently, in terms of the broad span of the family's history, been the war over the Landshut succession, which ended in the victory for Bavaria over the electorate. But now the electorate of Bavaria and the electorate of the Palatinate and the Duchy of Bavaria have also gone different religious routes, the same dynasty, but they find themselves on the polar opposite of the future conflict that's brewing. Part of the build up towards the 30 Years' War is the increasing allegiance of the Wittelsbach towards the Habsburgs. Bavaria, really up until the time of Maximilian II, towards the end of the 17th century, is seen as very deferential to the Habsburgs. In other words, they're more than willing to place the cause of Catholicism in Germany ahead of the interests of the dynasty. Essentially, when William IV and Ludwig abandoned their claim over Bohemia, such led a policy of Bavarian deference towards Austria. And part of this policy of deference was over something known as the Spanish Road. The Spanish controlled what is now modern-day Belgium. They also controlled various important sites in Italy, such as Milan and Lombardy. However, in order to get to these territories, one route, of course, went through Bavaria and through Western Germany across the Rhine in order to get to Belgium. And one of these routes went through Cologne. In 1583, there was a crisis in Cologne. Part of the expansion of Protestant influences was actually interning many of the independent bishops that you see throughout the Holy Roman Empire, turning them Protestant. And that way, essentially, the Protestants could increase their overall influence and power, prestige, religion throughout Germany. It was seen as a major cause for the consolidation of a Catholic League in opposition to the Protestants. But under Wilhelm V, the Bavarians intervened in that crisis, and they were so successful, they were able to basically establish a hereditary archbishopric in Cologne, which also happened to be a Wittelsbach electorate. So by the end of the 16th century, despite not being Holy Roman emperors, the Wittelsbachs controlled 3 of the 7 electorates. It was almost impossible to become emperor of the Holy Roman Empire without Wittelsbach acquiescence. The issue was, of course, 2 of the electors were Catholic and one of them was Calvinist. And being a Calvinist was also more incendiary because Calvinism wasn't even recognized as an established religion in the empire. Only Lutheranism was with the Treaty of Augsburg. So it's during this period, with the abdication of Wilhelm and the ascendancy of Maximilian, that Bavaria begins to consolidate. It's already consolidated its influence over the Spanish Road and over Cologne, but it attacks the city of Donauwörth, which had been mainly Protestant and had been placed under an imperial ban, otherwise a writ of outlawry by the empire, and then it begins to assume a prominent position within the nascent Catholic League. And just to underline this and Maximilian's character, I have a short segment from Peter Wilson's Europe's Tragedy, A History of the 30 Years' War. Wilhelm V brought his 24-year-old son Maximilian into the Bavarian government in 1594, and then handed it over completely 4 years later in order to retreat into a pious life of contemplation. Unlike other principal figures around the turn of the century, Duke Maximilian saw out the entire 30 Years' War and was the most influential and dynamic of the German Catholic princes. There is some debate over his character. While all agree he was determined and he was ambitious, his principal biographer, Dietrich Albrecht, rather overstresses his natural caution and circumspection. For reference, that's Dieter Albrecht's 1990 biography of Maximilian. And what is rather frustrating for people who don't read German is that almost, with the exception of Ludwig, almost unanimously, there are no major English translations of histories of the Wittelsbach dynasty. Sometimes you'll find them in French. A convinced Catholic, like his brother-in-law Ferdinand of Styria, that being the future Emperor Ferdinand II, Maximilian put himself through a punishing routine of personal devotion, spending hours daily at prayer or at Mass. He developed a particular attachment to the Virgin Mary, proclaiming her the patron of Bavaria in 1616 and dedicating himself to her in a vow written in his own blood and deposited in a silver tabernacle at the Allotting Shrine in 1645. Her intercession was sought before key decisions, for example, the intervention in Donauwort and the invasion of the Upper Palatinate in 1621, that being the territories of what is now basically seen as northern Bavaria, timed to coincide with important dates in her calendar. However, like Ferdinand, Maximilian's personal piety did not preclude dialogue with those not sharing his faith. In 1601, he restaged the famous disputation between Luther and Catholic theologians by inviting leading thinkers from both faiths to Regensburg to seek out common ground. Albrecht is certainly correct in presenting Maximilian as sharing Ferdinand's legalistic outlook on political action, inclining him to a deference towards the emperor that was both psychological as it was practical. Like his Saxon contemporaries, Maximilian still thought of the empire as a divinely ordered hierarchy and naturally looked to the emperor to provide guidance. The Saxons, by reference, were one of the most, under the Wetins, some of the most exalted Protestant princes within the empire. They weren't so keen in terms of inspiring a religious revolution to win the Protestant cause in Germany at all costs if it meant ultimately unraveling the whole social hierarchy and makeup of Germany. Maximilian was reluctant to act without prior imperial approval, seeking explicit sanction from the emperor before taking action, as well as negotiating safeguards in the case of failure. In other words, again, following a faithful process of pro-Catholicism and deference towards the Habsburgs. Such attitudes conditioned Bavaria to remain discreetly in the background, and it is unlikely that its dukes harboured long-standing plans to create a separate Catholic party under Bavarian leadership. But it is clear, like the Saxon and Palatine electors, that Maximilian was convinced that his own religious and dynastic goals were in the broader interest of his church and of the empire as a whole. The Duke felt that Catholics had given too much ground already since 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, and that it was high time for them to take a firm stand to prevent the empire siding into chaos. This stance was influenced by one book, the Autonomia, published in Munich in 1586 by Andreas Etzenberger, a secretary at the Reichshofrat, who criticized the toleration extended by the Catholic Politique faction in France in an attempt to pacify the Huguenots. The Politiques were against the Spanish-backed Catholic League, made concessions towards the Huguenots, but such policy that was pursued at first by figures like Catherine de' Medici completely unraveled when you have the iconic St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and if I recall, 1572. But nevertheless, there was much criticism directed at the French ruling family at the time, de Valois, including towards Henry III, when he was in fact assassinated in 1589, a couple of decades before the 30 Years' War. For Erstenberger, there could be no autonomy, since freedom of conscience was simply a license to serve the devil. Bavaria led the other Catholics at the 1594 Reichstag in threatening to walk out if the Magdeburg administrator was allowed to take up his seat. This action implied a concerted rejection of all the administrators as a precursor to bringing their bishoprics back into Catholic hands. And that is what I was referring to earlier with the Cologne crisis, that the bishop situation, having so many independent bishops in the Holy Roman Empire, was seen simply as a breeding ground for the Protestants to subvert them individually, whilst not actually conquering any territories. It was basically a crisis of confessional souls in these territories, if nothing else, winning over through converting various bishops. It's interesting if you look at the idea that Maximilian was so deferential to the Habsburgs, because there was quite a strong momentum behind a conspiracy to make Maximilian the elector of Bavaria, the soon-to-be elector of Bavaria, von Wittelsbach, the Holy Roman Emperor. In this, he would have been pitted against later Holy Roman Emperors Matthias and Ferdinand of Styria, who then became Ferdinand II. Now, there's a very obvious reasoning as to why the Protestants would favour such a cause. A Protestant could, of course, never become Holy Roman Emperor because he wouldn't have the requisite support. And it would obviously cause a civil war if the 30 Years' War wasn't already that obvious from the other side. But if Maximilian were named Holy Roman Emperor, then that would have meant a civil war among the Catholics, allowing the Protestants to basically pursue a policy of divide and conquer. So it seems remarkable that if there was a possibility, and given how many Wittelsbach electors there were, 3 out of 7, a serious possibility that Maximilian could have become emperor had he so basically sought out the position, that he effectively chose not to, in order to pursue a policy of deference towards the Habsburgs and maintain the unity of the Catholic League. But this is where the civil war between the two branches really heats up. Of course, the Palatinate had gone Protestant and then had gone Calvinist, but very much the leader of the Calvinist cause in Germany was none other than Frederick V, the member of the Wittelsbach family in the Palatinate. There was a crisis in Bohemia when Ferdinand II attempted again to become Holy Roman Emperor and take up all of his possessions in what was later to be known as the Habsburg monarchy. But Bohemia, as I mentioned already with the succession crisis, was unhappily part of the Habsburg Empire, and it decided that Bohemia was not a hereditary kingdom, it was an elected kingdom, and they decided to elect a Protestant ruler, none other than Frederick, to come in and assume his position as the Winter King, the king who ruled over one season, only to be defeated decisively by the Austrians at the Battle of White Mountain. So Wittelsbach had finally, after the aborted attempts by William IV nearly 100 years before, made a ambitious gambit to become king of Bohemia and failed dramatically. And this, in many ways, is the beginning of the 30 Years' War. Now that Frederick V had presented himself as the stalwart enemy of the new emperor, Ferdinand II, it gave Maximilian and the Bavarian branch of the Wittelsbach family a unique opportunity. All the way back 300 years ago, when Charles IV of the House of Luxembourg, another king of Bohemia, was tearing up the Bavarian emperor's legacy, an electorate had not been given to Bavaria, allowing it to fall into division and potentially to the point where it could never recover, which it essentially did through a series of fortunate deaths in the broader Wittelsbach family. But Maximilian pursues his own war against his cousin, the Protestant branch of the Wittelsbach family, and by 1623 he has effectively won. Bavaria is strong, it is wealthy, it has a very large army, and it gains the position of elector of the Holy Roman Empire, taking it away from the Wittelsbachs and the Palatinate. Indeed, at this point, he's actually a double elector, holding 2 electorships over Bavaria, Bavaria and the Palatinate. Oh, and in case again I didn't emphasize this and I made the mistake, the Wittelsbachs will eventually acquire 3 of the 7 electorates. They didn't prior to the moment in 1623 when we have the conquest of Maximilian. Sorry for that error. But this is not to say that because Maximilian was pursuing a Catholic policy and he was pursuing a policy of deference towards the Holy Roman Emperor, that he didn't have his own objectives. And the objective essentially was to maintain his conquests, to maintain the unity of the Wittelsbachs under a Catholic ruler, actually make some concessions to the Protestants in the conquered territories, and to achieve a peace on his own initiative. So in 1630, he attempts to reach out to the French. Already the Danes had invaded Germany and failed, and this was a year before the Swedes would dramatically intervene, but attempts basically to straddle both sides of the conflict, appealing to France to mediate and prevent a Swedish intervention fail. The Swedes intervene, and they will spend the next 20 years ravishing much of Bavaria's countryside, making it one of the primary targets for devastation in the 30 Years' War. In opposition to that, we have the creation of Franz von Mercy's Catholic Bavarian army. The Bavarians fight all the way up until 1648, when they are defeated at the Battle of Zusmarhausen. Ultimately, if you're going to look at the 30 Years' War, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the Bavarian Wittelsbachs against the Palatinate. if you consider the devastation and the Swedish intervention and the fact that Bavaria was only able to gain control over the quote-unquote Upper Palatinate, which is northern Bavaria, while the rest of the Palatinate, the territory on the Rhineland, was given back over to the heirs of Frederick V. And whilst Maximilian was able to hold on to his position as an elector of the Holy Roman Empire, there were now 8 electors and not 7, and his defeated cousins essentially had been reconfirmed in their place, almost you can say at the behest and demands of the French, who were now decisively intervening in the affairs of the Holy Roman Empire. What he had achieved, despite, you can say, another Pyrrhic victory, like we see with Albert the Wise also pursuing more aggressive policies, only to be hemmed in and crushed by a more powerful coalition, such is almost invariably the case when it comes to Bavaria. Whether it be the Wittelsbachers basically being defeated by the Luxembourgers and the Habsburgs, whether it be Albert hemmed in by Emperor Frederick III, or now Maximilian hemmed in by the French. These are gains, these are incremental gains. They don't seem so significant. But Maximilian has been able to consolidate his firm control over the state and the creation of a Bavarian army. Much of the institutions, and you can say legacies of feudalism, have basically been wiped out. Much of the state had become streamlined and centralized. And what could have been a major crisis for the dynasty, a potential succession crisis for Maximilian, was averted when his Baron Duchess Elizabeth of Lorraine died, and he was able to remarry Maria Anna, daughter of Ferdinand II von Habsburg, and this marriage produced a son, Ferdinand Maria. Ferdinand was able to continue his father's policy of this Habsburg deference, including again refusing to get involved in the 1658 imperial election in order to advocate his own claim, and he would in turn support the Austrians in their various wars against the Turks. But because his reign is known as a period of peace, reconsolidation, building up the Bavarian economy after the disaster of the 30 Years' War, Ferdinand is best known for his artistic patronage, in particular the construction of the Nymphenburg Palace, one of the most iconic pieces of German Baroque that exists, a palace that was intended to rival Versailles, establishing a Bavarian Versailles. Now here we come to one of the most ambitious, adventuring rulers of the turn of the 18th century. A king who never was. Someone I find, you can say, fascinating in terms of all of the what ifs, and he managed to fail all of them rather spectacularly and end his career as a complete failure. A Bavarian Pyrrhus of Epirus. I've already thrown around the term Pyrrhic victory in many cases, but this wasn't even a Pyrrhic victory. This was him being killed by a random peasant throwing a stone at him on the streets of Sparta. Maximilian began his reign by a sort of subtle reversal of the dynasty's stance towards France and deference towards the Habsburgs when he married his older sister off to the Grand Dauphin, the heir of Louis XIV in 1680. He then went off to have a significant role in the Great Turkish War. For reference, in 1683, a rejuvenated Ottoman Empire attacks Vienna. They are defeated as a result of a coalition of Catholic and Protestant powers, and of course the decisive intervention of Jan Sobieski and the Polish cavalry. But when the Turks are defeated in 1683, the Austrians don't stop. They continue to make significant gains, and within a decade they have more or less reconquered the entirety of Hungary that had been lost some 150 years before at the Battle of Mohacs. In particular, Maximilian, fighting the war alongside the Habsburgs as a partisan of the Habsburgs and the Holy League, what has sometimes been referred to as one of the last genuine crusades, was responsible for the capture of the city of Belgrade in 1688, alongside one of the greatest ever generals in the employ of the Austrian army, Eugene of Savoy. And for that, he won vast amounts of European accolades. And given his preeminence as an imperial general, and given his exalted station as the most powerful elector in the Holy Roman Empire, the Elector of Bavaria, he was given over to marriage to Maria Antonia, the only daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold. And this is where we begin to see the ruin of Maximilian in terms of his incredibly ambitious policies. The first is that of his Spanish policy. After he returned from his heroic adventures against the Ottoman Empire in service of Austria, he went over to the court of the Spanish Habsburgs and became the governor of the Spanish Netherlands. Usually, the governorship of the Spanish Netherlands was handed over to a Habsburg, but because he was married to Maria Antonia, he was suitably proximate to the Habsburg dynasty in order to serve in that position as effective governor. And it's there that he made connections not only between the Austrian court and the Spanish court in Madrid, but also with the French court, because all of these powers were eyeing the potential of a major succession crisis in Europe, that being the Spanish succession. As you can see on the map on the right, the area in red was a greater part of Western Europe. It was one of the most powerful states in Europe throughout the 16th and the 17th centuries, and it was under the rule of Charles the Bewitched, a ruler who inexplicably lived too long but had no chance of siring any children. And so for decades, the question of his death and his succession dominated the strategic calculus in Europe and involved nearly every European power. And it was into this powder keg of a policy that Maximilian of Bavaria decided to intervene and provide a solution. Having been the governor of the Spanish Netherlands, again, he was in a very powerful position in terms of the Spanish court. Because he was married to Maria Antonia, he was related to the Habsburgs, but he was able to provide an heir through Joseph Ferdinand, the little prince that you see in the middle. For a while, there was a major concern over a potential war, a war that would ultimately break out, called the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 until 1714. The idea is that if the Habsburgs won the entire Spanish inheritance, the French would go to war. Likewise, if the French were able to provide a candidate that would inherit the Spanish Empire, the Habsburgs would go to war against France. And this is because the Spanish dynasty of Habsburgs had married widely into the various European families. A Spanish Habsburg had married Louis XIV, making one of his children, in particular his son, the Dauphin, a major candidate to become the King of Spain. But eventually the policy was deferred away from the Grand Dauphin to one of his sons, a grandson of Louis XIV, thereby ensuring that no one single person would rule over France and Spain at the same time. While in the case of the Habsburgs, the idea was one of Leopold, the Holy Roman Emperor's sons, in this case Charles or Karl, later Karl VI, Holy Roman Emperor, would become King of Spain. However, either situation, which favoured France or the Austrians, albeit with this compromise of allowing a second son to inherit, thereby maintaining the fiction that these empires were separate, would still have led to war. And so the birth of Joseph Ferdinand offered a potential route to peace, allowing for a Bavarian candidate to inherit the throne of Spain. If you think about the logistics, had Joseph Ferdinand succeeded, and by extension had Maximilian II ruled over his son's empire as an effective regent, then the Wittelsbach dynasty would have been potentially as powerful as the Habsburgs were once upon a time, and more powerful than the Bourbon family in terms of not only having a significant stake in Germany, in Bavaria, influence over the Palatinate and now the Low Countries. It would have been a reversal of so many hundreds of years of decline for the Habsburgs. I mentioned the fact that the Burgundian Netherlands, the Austrian Netherlands, the Spanish Netherlands really began as the Wittelsbach Netherlands. Well, again, this would have been a dramatic turn of fate towards the Bavarian Wittelsbachs. All of this is a possibility of having the Bavarian King of Spain. All of that died when Joseph Ferdinand died of smallpox in 1698, 3 years before the bewitched King of Spain would ultimately die. And because this was such a significant, you can say, action event in terms of the history of Europe, many people were accused of essentially poisoning the prince. But it also spelled a disaster for Maximilian II and his incredibly ambitious foreign policy. So his Spanish policy was effectively in tatters. Next, there was the idea of pursuing a Polish policy. Because the Sobieski family and the Habsburgs and the Holy League had fought alongside each other in the Great Turkish War, Maximilian had cultivated a very favorable impression in Poland. In fact, he was now married to Teresa Sobieska, the daughter of King Jan Sobieski. Had he seriously pursued the policy, he could have potentially become king of Poland-Lithuania, given that the other candidate, the Elector of Saxony, Augustus the Strong, was a Protestant. There was no such qualm when it came to Maximilian II because he was a Catholic, but he couldn't pursue the Spanish policy and the Polish policy simultaneously. And so ultimately the Saxon policy won out because Maximilian decided to pursue one over the other, but there was a possibility that there could have been a Bavarian and not a Wettin on the throne of Poland. You have to look at this in terms of a context of really a rush of various rulers in the early 18th century to become kings. Perhaps the most famous example is actually King George of King George of England, who started off as the Elector of Hanover. When his mother, the Electress Sophia, died, George in 1714 becomes king, the first Hanoverian king of Great Britain. In Saxony, of course, you have the example I've already mentioned of the Elector Augustus becoming king of Poland. In Italy, you have the instance of the Duke of Savoy, Victor Amadeus, becoming first king of Sicily and then king of Sardinia. And then you have the other famous instance of the Prince Elector of Prussia and Brandenburg, Frederick, becoming King Frederick of Prussia. The king in Prussia, which his grandson Frederick the Great will then elevate to the Kingdom of Prussia, one of the most significant political states in Europe going forward. So among this rush to become kings, it seems that Bavaria has been defeated on all fronts. All the avenues open for Bavaria to establish a kingdom in Spain or a kingdom in Poland have effectively been thwarted. And when the War of Spanish Succession breaks out, being the governor of the Spanish Netherlands, and given the fact that finally in his will, the bewitched King of Spain gives his throne to a French candidate, Philip of Anjou, over a Habsburg candidate, Bavaria finds itself fighting alongside the French. The French and the Bavarians are defeated dramatically at the Battle of Blenheim by the Duke of Marlborough and the erstwhile compatriot and comrade of the Elector of Bavaria, Eugene of Savoy, and then they are defeated again at Ramillies, and this leads to a 10-year occupation of Bavaria, destroying the prestige of Maximilian and costing him all of his funds. When there is a rebellion in Bavaria to try and again bring back the rule of the Elector, it's crushed by the Austrians in 1706. It could have been much worse for the Bavarians. It could have actually led to a potential permanent partition of the Bavarian territory. I mentioned the fact that so much of the 30 Years' War for Bavaria in the 17th century can be seen as a family civil war, that being Maximilian, the Great Elector, wanting to dispossess his Wittelsbach cousins in the Palatinate. Well, this is a dramatic reversal of fate, where it would look as if the Palatinate branch of the family, coming back in a vengeance, would actually destroy the Bavarian branch of the family. The other part of Bavaria would, of course, be given over to Austria. But at the Treaty of Rastatt, in which France finally begins to make gains at the expense of the coalition opposing her, the British and the Austrians, the French have begun to take over places in the Spanish Netherlands like Luxembourg, Namur, Hainaut, and those territories were given over to Maximilian II to rule as basically a consolation prize. at the Treaty of Rastatt, which finally concluded the War of Spanish Succession, those territories were relinquished back essentially to Austria, but in return for the full restoration of Bavaria. So, as a result of the intervention of Louis XIV, Bavaria was saved. Perhaps going back to my Herrenchiemsee example, you can say this is a moment of French contrivance sparing Bavaria, or you can look at this as an incredibly overly ambitious Bavarian prince going from ruin to ruin, disaster to disaster, failing in all of his overly ambitious dynastic schemes. Um, Kind of like what we see with Ludwig the Fourth and the Bavarian Emperor, to be honest, only to be saved at the end by his steadfast ally, the French. Um, it's a far more complicated situation that affords the Wittelsbachs a lot of historical agency. What would actually turn out to be his most significant legacy was the arranging of a marriage between his son to one Maria Amalia, the daughter of the Emperor Joseph, and, as it turns out, one of the heirs of Austria during the War of Austrian Succession. When Charles Albert finally becomes elector in 1726, following his father's disastrous reign, he renews this sense of French affinity. The Austrian Empire had been going through a crisis of succession because there was no male heir for the Austrian territories, and the previous Emperor Joseph had two daughters. However, the current emperor, Karl, was wanting to dispossess his elder nieces, who surely had preeminence in the succession, in order to ensure that his daughter, Mary Theresa, become ruler of the empire. To make matters worse, the two elder daughters of Joseph had married into the two most prestigious houses elsewhere in Germany, the Wettins of Saxony and the Bavarian Wittelsbachs, Maria Anna in particular, as I mentioned, marrying Charles Albert, giving both the Saxons and the Bavarians a claim on the Holy Roman Empire. When the war breaks out in 1740, it's actually the Prussians completely bypassing the question of who will be Holy Roman Emperor and going to take over the province of Silesia in particular that starts the ball rolling. But Austria ultimately decides to side along with the Prussians and make a decisive gambit to become Holy Roman Emperors once again. And this is Peter Wilson's short account. Whereas Frederick II of Prussia sought additional territory to bolster Prussia's European status, that being in Silesia, Bavaria's elector, Charles Albert, made a bid for the imperial crown in the manner of the late medieval struggles to rule over the empire, that being reminiscent of what we have with Ludwig IV, the Bavarian emperor. Bavarian intervention paradoxically demonstrated the success of Habsburg methods since 1438. Although able to secure election as Emperor Charles VII, the Wittelsbach emperor, on the 24th of January 1742, the Bavarian elector was unable to establish any stable imperial rule. Meanwhile, Mary Theresa and her husband, Francis Stephen, the Duke of Lorraine, and the Habsburg candidate to become Holy Roman Emperor, were able to survive on the considerable resources of the Habsburg lands, supplemented by Anglo-Dutch support. Bavaria was already weak and only managed to launch its bid for Habsburg possessions 8 months after Prussia's invasion of Silesia, a move that caused considerable disquiet among the other electors and contributed to a 15-month imperial interregnum. In other words, Bavaria may have had even loftier designs vis-a-vis the Prussians, but the Prussians had the better army and they had the better leader and the more decisive strategic goals. Loyalty to the Habsburgs remained strong amongst some middling and minor imperial estates. The Bavarian elector eventually triumphed over Francis, the Habsburg candidate, thanks to massive French and Prussian pressure, combined with discontent over the last decade of Charles VI's reign and concern at Austria's great power interest. What is meant there is that the French and the Prussians were backing Charles to become Holy Roman Emperor. Both France and Prussia were at war with Austria. And the concern was that Austria was already too great a power within the Holy Roman Empire. What better way to check the growing power of the Austrians and the Habsburgs than to have a relatively less powerful ruler, like the Bavarian Wittelsbachs taking over nominal headship over the empire. The Austrian Empire and its army entered Munich 2 days after Charles VII's election, amply demonstrating Bavaria's incapacity to sustain imperial rule. Bavarian revenue in 1742 was only 1.9 million florins, compared to an expenditure of 6.48 million, of which 4.5 went to the army, which still totaled only 25,000 soldiers, many of whom were hastily pressed militiamen. France supplied 8.8 million florins in aid, but Bavaria's debts had climbed to over 32 million by the time of Charles's death in 1745. Despite his deteriorating military situation, Charles VII's initial reception was fairly favourable. 50 princes and counts attended his coronation in person on the 12th of February 1742, while representation at the Reichstag improved as several estates sent envoys after long absences. The Reichstag voted assistance, which, when combined with contributions from the imperial knights, provided 3 to 3.5 million florins across Charles's reign. This did not, however, constitute formal endorsement of his war with Austria, which was regarded as a private matter, which the Reichstag adopting a position of official neutrality. The South and Western circles, the groupings of Holy Roman Imperial regions, mobilized troops to uphold this until 1748. Charles was forced to make concessions to win support. 15 counts were raised to princely status, with some of them providing troops for the Bavarian army. More significantly, Charles granted Prussians ceremonial distinctions matching Austrian status, including according Frederick II the right to be called Majesty, enabling him to become the king of rather than the king in Prussia. Prussian support was retained by recognizing its possession of Silesia as a sovereign duchy, raising doubts as to whether it still belonged to the empire, while Spanish cooperation was purchased through conceding plans for a new kingdom to be created from Austria's possessions in northern Italy. Meanwhile, the other electors were mollified by revisions to the emperor's electoral agreement in 1742, confirming that they were no longer personally obliged to seek confirmation of their fiefs at the start of each reign. More damaging still, Charles's offer to renounce claims to Austria and Bohemia if Bavaria was recognized as a kingdom. When that failed, he proposed ending the war at the expense of the imperial church and a new wave of secularizations. Although intended as a secret, details of these negotiations were leaked, exposing Charles's inability to deliver promise to be the small man's emperor, favoring the minor imperial estates against the two great German powers. In other words, if he was going to be the small man's emperor, that would have been the emperor of the bishops and the emperors of the free cities, the emperor of the imperial knights, versus the more powerful and consolidated rulers like the electors, like the King of Great Britain and Hanover, and of course the King of Prussia, let alone the ruler of Austria, the Queen of Hungary, and the Queen of Bohemia. What should be re-stressed is that Charles, like his cousin Frederick V, the Winter King, attempted also to make a claim on Bohemia. Had he again stayed in Prague and consolidated that position, then the Wittelsbach family would have had, along with a Prussian alliance and French backing, a strong enough position of support in order to actually run an empire directed from Munich. Alas, the adventure into Bohemia was relatively short-lived, and like we see with Frederick V, the Wittelsbachs were removed from Bohemia. The concession essentially being that Bavaria renounced all those claims in order to become a kingdom in its own right, and as we see, they wouldn't attain the position of being a kingdom until Napoleon. Indeed, you can say this goes back all the way to pre-Wittelsbach Bavaria, when it was thwarted in its basically aspirations to become a kingdom in its own right, a medieval kingdom. Instead, it was split off to form Italian counties and what would later become Austria. Again, how history would have been different if Austria and Bavaria had remained united as it was in the early medieval period. As it pertains to someone like Charles, it's very interesting, this eagle on the right, the double-headed eagle with the Wittelsbach Palatinate lions and the lozenges and the scepter and the orb in the middle. One of these very rare instances of the Wittelsbach actually having attained the position of Holy Roman Emperors again, even if very briefly, and nothing more than basically a footnote in the War of Austrian Succession. In terms of the humiliation and the demise of the emperor, not only was he chased out of Munich right after his election, basically depriving him of his own source of revenue raising and raising troops, but he basically had to spend the majority of his reign not in Munich but in Frankfurt, living as a relatively impoverished emperor, whilst accruing, as Wilson has stated, massive debts for the Bavarian treasury, which will have to go on till Maximilian III, his son. The only consolation he had is that he died an emperor. He wasn't dispossessed and imprisoned in the end. He was simply impoverished and ultimately irrelevant. And despite being an emperor, and despite granting these majestic titles and elevations to Frederick II, King of Prussia, his legacy would be completely outshone by Frederick. And what could have emerged in the 18th century as a Bavarian parity to Austria inevitably became a Prussian parity to Austria. So when Maximilian, his son, becomes ruler, concedes the fact that the Austrians will regain the positions of Holy Roman Empire, Bavaria now needs to chart a new course in this new reality. There is a new diarchy, a German dualism in the Holy Roman Empire between Austria and Prussia. And Bavaria, as far as Maximilian III's interests are concerned, is basically pursuing a policy of neutrality, if not even realigning with the Habsburgs again. One can say, looking at this in the round, that the Bavarians and their policy went absolutely disastrously whenever they broke this traditional policy of deference towards the Habsburgs and instead decided to pursue a very ambitious course, often with French backing. Maximilian II had tried that and failed dramatically. Charles VII have now tried that and failed dramatically. So Maximilian III, you can say, was actually returning to a more cautious, more pragmatic and more sensible foreign policy that wasn't so concerned with making Bavaria a kingdom or an empire. During the 7 Years' War, however, Maximilian III did tentatively decide to support the Austrians at first. He's also known for the fact that there was a dramatic Jesuit reversal during the reign of Maximilian III. Bavaria, during the first half of the 18th century, was the summit of Rococo, and it epitomized Baroque. If you go to the churches, the monasteries, the palaces, Bavaria is resplendent and it's wealthy when it comes to these extravagant physical monuments, and later again with the 19th century. We add to that music. But in the case of someone like a Maximilian III, he is in many ways a mirror to Frederick II in that he pursues a new dramatic religious policy, beginning to remove the anchor of Catholic politics that had been the bedrock of Wittelsbach rule really since William IV in 1524 during the Peasants' War, so dramatically opposed the rise of Protestantism compared to his other local princes in Swabia. And the Jesuit reversal is the most keen. As I was keen to emphasize earlier, in 1541, Bavaria, especially under William V, had been a state to really embrace Jesuitism in all sort of aspects of court, religious, and educational life. But not only are the Jesuits slowly removed from positions of influence, but when the papacy decides to endorse basically the suppression of the Jesuits, Maximilian III goes along with these policies rather enthusiastically, and in 1770 completes the suppression in Austria, basically ending an epoch for Bavarian Catholicism. Given the fact he was also responsible for attempting to establish a Bavarian civil code, what we'd later see with the consolidations of laws like in, to a less extent in Prussia, but definitely in the case in France, you can see Maximilian III as not just a return to moderation, but in trying to create a new course away from Bavaria's solidly Catholic identity. Maximilian III was in many ways Bavaria's answer to quote-unquote enlightened despotism. A decade later, we'll see that with Joseph II. who, as it turns out, will have a significant influence over the future of Bavaria going forward. Because when Maximilian III dies, he precipitates a succession crisis. No children survived him, and there had been many attempts in the preceding decades to prevent the dissolution of the mainline branch of the senior Wittelsbach family in Bavaria. So in 1742, when Charles VII was emperor and de Wittelsbach again was reigning over the Holy Roman Empire, the two branches of the family, the Bavarian branch and the Palatinate branch under Charles III, decided on a vast series of marriages, and very little actually came of these marriages. And Charles III died shortly after, and the emperor himself died shortly after. All of the succession hopes in terms of ensuring the continuation of the dynasty, which was basically one branch was failing after another, and lesser branches, junior branches of the family were found elsewhere in Germany to prop it up. With the death of Clemens Franz, a cousin of Maximilian III, and if I recall, a grandson of Maximilian II, and the death of his two sons, there was no heir left among the Bavarian branch for Maximilian III. And so the only heir was Charles Theodore, the elector of the Palatinate, who had basically broken off from Bavaria some 400 years before. Charles Theodore was a very interesting and dishonorable character. He had no legitimate children, but he had plenty of bastards, like his Saxon counterpart, Augustus the Strong. Like Maximilian II, he had great ambitions in the Austrian Netherlands and Belgium. Of course, Maximilian II had been governor there. And Charles Theodore was far more interested in finding new territories in which to give his bastard sons new little principalities of their own, because he could not pass any of his inheritance for his bastards in Bavaria because of Salic law. He could, however, give his bastards little territories in what is now Belgium, because again, it was slightly different in terms of the configuration of law, where women could rule over Belgium, but they couldn't rule over parts of Germany. So Charles Theodore embarked on a partition scheme with the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II. Joseph II would gain eastern Bavaria, the area around Passau and the lower region of the Danube, possibly even more territory. And in exchange, Charles Theodore would gain a large section of the Austrian Netherlands, allowing for the Wittelsbach to finally gain a outlet onto the sea. Now, this caused a major European crisis. Not only would it have been the end of Bavaria as we know it, not only did it indicate that Charles Theodore did not care about his Bavarian inheritance, he was simply looking at his bargaining chip in order to gain a different inheritance, that in Belgium. But there was the issue, because he had no legitimate children, he had an heir of his own who was expected to succeed Charles II of the Zweibrücken branch of the Wittelsbach family. And Charles II expected to inherit Bavaria and then the Palatinate whole. He didn't want a truncated and mangled inheritance as a result of Charles Theodore's attempt to pass off domains to his bastards. And so Charles II formed an alliance with Frederick II of Prussia to intervene to save Bavaria in what rather infamously became known afterwards as the Potato War, given the fact that both Austria and Prussia mobilized their armies to fight off about the Bavarian question. Very little was achieved, and ultimately a diplomatic solution was reached, whereby Charles Theodore dropped all of his plans and accept his inheritance of Bavaria and not trying to exchange it for something else. As for why Prussia was so incensed about the idea, they were incensed about the idea of Austria gaining German-speaking territories at the expense of French-speaking territories, thereby artificially increasing their influence over Germany vis-à-vis Prussia, which was a very justified concern when it comes to Prussia, given the fact that Bavaria also was trying to maintain a delicate balancing act between the two German superpowers at the time. If you're going to look at Charles Theodore and his complete apathy towards Bavaria, and the fact, again, by all rights, he should have been bypassed in the succession. When the French Revolution happens, he does very little in terms of marshalling Bavaria's resources to get the army into fighting condition. When the French begin to make serious gains into, first of all, Mayence to the French on the right bank of the Rhine, what does Charles Theodore do? He basically lets it happen. When the French cross over the Rhine and invade Bohemia in 1796, Charles Theodore flees to Saxony. So when he dies 3 years later, Bavaria is left in complete disarray, leading to a dramatic and, as it turns out, a momentous reversal in Bavaria's fortunes and status. Maximilian inherited the heirdom of Bavaria when his elder brother, Charles II of Zweibrücken, predeceased Charles Theodore of the Palatinate, becoming Elector of Bavaria in 1799, which was a failing state. He will begin his alliance with the Austrians. He will go on to lose the Battle of Hohenlinden alongside the Austrians under Archduke Charles, the Archduke Johann, and he will lose all of the Bavarian Palatinate and all of the Wittelsbach territories west of the Rhine when the Treaty of Lunéville is signed between Austria and France, which confirms France's quote-unquote natural boundaries at the Rhine. And this is where Montgelas enters the scene, this rather insalubrious character that you see on the bottom right corner of this slide. Montgelas was actually a former member of the Bavarian Illuminati, but because he was socially well connected and rather prominent in Bavarian society, many of his, again, patrons and supporters tried to find him a job whilst essentially avoiding any sort of memory or connection with his ignominious past. For reference, the Bavarian Illuminati reached its sort of peak of influence following the suppression of the Jesuits, but was in itself suppressed in 1783. But despite being a member of the Bavarian Illuminati, Montgelas became the private secretary to Maximilian before he became heir of Bavaria. So when Maximilian, through, again, a series of, from the point of view of Montgelas's position, a series of fortunate accidents, Maximilian was now the Elector of Bavaria, and Montgelas was the most trusted advisor to the new Elector, soon to be king. Following the Treaty of Lunéville, when France gained all these territories on the left bank of the Rhine and the Wittelsbachs lost so much, a lot of unscrupulous diplomats like Talleyrand and even Tsar Alexander of Russia looked on this as an opportunity to divide up German territory to suit the various alliances of the powers at play. It basically gave Napoleon in many ways a free hand to affect the policy in Germany, a precursor to what we have with the Napoleonic Confederation of the Rhine or the Rhinebund. Bavaria had to be compensated for the fact that it had lost so much territory fighting alongside Austria to France, and the goal was something that had been started all the way back when Charles VII was desperate to gain funds when he began secularizing church land, which was to do just that, remove all the independent bishoprics in Germany, award them to hereditary rulers. In the case of Bavaria, Bavaria was granted Würzburg, Bamberg, Augsburg, Passau, and Freisingen in the German mediatizations, which, on the one hand, yes, Bavaria lost the Palatinate, but now it was gaining, as you can see on this map, an increasingly large continuous territory, making it by far the most powerful of all the German states compared to Prussia. When Napoleon was beginning, you can say, his attack on Britain at Boulogne, expecting basically the French Navy to join him and for him to invade England, England forms an alliance with Austria and Russia, the War of the Third Coalition, which is ratified in the late summer of 1805. This is an opportunity in which Napoleon reaches out to the Bavarians and forms the Treaty of Bogenhausen, whereby France and Bavaria are formally allied for the first time in the Napoleonic Wars. And this is significant. Up until now, the Bavarians had acquiesced and Montgelas had basically wooed over the French in terms of gaining these concessions and the mediatizations. But now Bavaria was a firm ally of France and obviously the first route of invasion in any campaign, as we see with Max Ulm campaign. And Napoleon will, of course, have to pass through Bavaria in order to reach Vienna and ultimately Austerlitz. You can say that forming an alliance with France was an incredibly risky endeavor for Montgelas and Maximilian, but it turned out to be a remarkable boon in the short term. Not only did Napoleon win against the Austrians at Ulm and at Austerlitz, but he won decisively and forced the Austrians into an incredibly disadvantageous peace, the Treaty of Pressburg. And it was during this peace that Bavaria, for its newly minted alliance with France, was awarded the Tyrol. The Tyrol, which had been fought over by the Austrians and the Habsburgs going all the way back to the 14th century, and harkens back to this whole Roman idea, as you can see here, with Rhaetia being, you can say, the natural classical conception of Bavaria south of the Danube. That whole notion was being restored, which is quite appropriate because a lot of the foreign policy about the French Revolution and Napoleonic France and the Napoleonic Empire in Europe was about rediscovering these old proto sort of German migrations, Roman classical era configurations like Helvetia and Batavia. So why not Rhaetia as well in Bavaria? But the final coup de grace was that in 1806, a few days following the Treaty of Pressburg, as per a marriage pact between Eugene de Beauharnais and a Bavarian princess, Maximilian was given the title King of Bavaria alongside the new kings of Saxony and the King of Württemberg. In 1808, alongside this new sort of process of Frenchification, Montgelas created a French-style Napoleonic constitution for the new Bavarian kingdom. It abolished serfdom, it provided secular education, it provided the impetus for a theoretical legislature. If you know anything about Napoleonic France, you will know that in theory, the laws were essentially passed by a legislative corps, but in reality, even when it came to the Senate, which was a more influential house compared to the legislative corps, Napoleon more or less had dictatorial control over France. Montgelas wasn't interested in terms of actually ensuring that this theoretical legislature actually met. He was far too concerned in terms of determining Bavarian policy on its own. He was also responsible for a new penal code in Bavaria, which involved the abolition of torture. Very sort of, you can say, modern for its time, decriminalization of homosexuality. Remember, this was until recently a thoroughly Catholic state. And of course, for the sake of continuing Napoleon's wars, the imposition of conscription. But you also have the Dienst Pragmatique, which was a standardization for a model civil service system, which ultimately provided a model for later Germany to follow. And part of the emphasis on high civil service standards and making civil service and officers at court and the ministries open to all, following on from the French system of meritocracy, quote unquote, was about dethroning the influence of the Bavarian aristocracy. This attempt, you can say, to expand Bavaria into the south and make the Tyrol Bavarian as it had been centuries before, precipitated a revolt by Andreas Hofer and the War of the Fifth Coalition, in which once again Bavaria was invaded by Austria and France had to come in and defeat the Austrians at the Battle of Wagram, despite the fact that Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Essling. Again, it's one of these instances where Austria, for a brief amount of time, could have actually led the cause of German unification, and it would have started in the Tyrol. But nevertheless, this actually begins a policy where we see the beginning of Napoleon's decline. Napoleon had already invaded Spain, which was disastrous for Napoleon. In 1812, Napoleon would invade Russia, which was even more disastrous. And even Bavaria, which had gained so much from its alliance with France, was beginning to sense the wind. And at the Treaty of Reed, it begins a dramatic reversal. Once in 1813, it looks clear that even the Austrians, who had also, like Bavaria, formed a belated alliance with France, were turning tail and going to support the coalition armies in defeating Napoleon. This is a brief segment from Daniel Klang's Bavaria and the War of Liberation. On the 8th of October 1813, the Bavarian government broke with France and ceded to Austrian demands for full participation in the Allied war effort. The Treaty of Reed, ending nearly 10 years of tumultuous association with the man of Brumaire, that being Napoleon, was a perfectly reasonable step for Munich. A vastly superior Austrian army was posed on the Salzburg frontier, and Napoleon was far away. Indeed, what must be explained is Bavaria's late arrival on the side of the coalition 9 full months after York's Convention of Tauroggen. What that means is that when the 1812 campaign was over, when Napoleon had completed his disastrous withdrawal, the Prussians had basically been press-ganged into an alliance with France against Russia, and one of the Prussian generals, von York, famously went over to the Russians and declared that his Prussian army was going to support a coalition war against France. This was effectively a general deciding the foreign policy of Prussia before the king had basically decided to turn and join the Russians in their alliance in their war, the War of the Sixth Coalition against the French. An answer readily available is that the Bavarians simply were following their own interests, unmoved by the wave of patriotism which had broken over Germany. The profound moral corruption of particularistic life, Treitschke called it. Another and less offended historian, Michael de Brel, tells us that the Bavarian foreign minister resolved to desert Napoleon in the spring of 1813. But ever the calculating diplomat, he waited for the best terms for Austria, and until he was sure the French were to be beaten. Love of France was as little importance to Montgelas as German nationalism. His loyalty was to Bavaria alone. As to why Treitschke would have such admonishment for Bavaria's stance in basically pursuing a pro-Bavarian course as opposed to a pro-German course, is the fact that Treitschke was a Prussian nationalist. And even if you look at someone like Kurt Eisner, who was responsible for the deposition of the Bavarian monarchy, there is a strand in Bavarian particularism and counter-German nationalism which was always virulently anti-Prussian. As we're going to see, it actually forms part of the reason as to why the monarchy was ultimately deposed in the end, is this juggling act essentially between seeing deference towards German unification and deference towards Prussia, as indeed it had been in the 30 Years' War, which was the cause of the empire, was seen as deference towards the Habsburgs. As a result of this new dramatic change of the alliance system, by which Bavaria had gained very handsomely from its temporary alliance with France, and then decided under Montgelas's direction to switch right at the point again where Bavaria could have maintained most of its gains, it resulted not in loss of territories, but in compensation for various territories. So the Bavarians, as a result of this, lost the territories that they eventually gained at the expense of Austria, which is to be expected, given Austria was the great victor from the wars. So the Bavarians lost Vorarlberg, the Tyrol, and Salzburg, and in return they regained Würzburg, Fulda, and Aschaffenburg, as well as restoring the Palatinate on the left bank of the Rhine. The hope, as you can see on this map, this earlier map here, all the way back here on the right, which was the post-Napoleonic map, which was, if you look at the map on the left, which again, pre-French Revolutionary War, is a massive expansion into the north at the expense of Bayreuth, Würzburg, Bamberg, Nuremberg, and Ansbach. The logic would be to connect Würzburg of Landau through Baden. The expectation from the Bavarians was that they would finally form a continuous territory between Bavaria and the Palatinate, and this was to be done through the succession of Baden, whose dynasty was about to die out, and at least there would be a partition between the territories, allowing for Bavaria to gain a link. However, when that finally happened in 1818, at the Congress of A, the Bavarians were snubbed. They were unable to unite Bavaria through northern Baden, and instead Baden went to the House of Hochburg. If that had not happened, had the Bavarians essentially achieved all of their aims of uniting the territories together, then it's very possible that with the modern free state of Bavaria, that the Palatinate would still be part of Bavaria even today. It wouldn't be part of the Rhineland-Palatinate, which it is in terms of the Länder of Germany. So that was the territorial policy of the House of Bavaria. And as you can see, even though there was a significant loss of the mountain regions in the Tyrol, Bavaria gained significantly as a result of it, but it also had a drastic effect in terms of the demographics of Bavaria. And that in many ways actually motivated the secularization reforms that we see under Montgelas. And given the fact that he was a former member of the Illuminati, none of this should surprise you. In 1801, even before the Napoleonic Concordat, Catholic non-residency was finally given. Remember, this was a policy that was established nearly 2 centuries earlier, during the height of the Tridentine Reform and the association with the Jesuits, that to be Bavarian and have residency in Bavaria required a writ of Catholicism. In 1803, there were further edicts of toleration for Protestants, including finally the right of having mixed marriages between Protestants and Catholics. In 1813, there were major Jewish concessions made, and by 1817, Lutherans, Calvinists, and other groups such as the Mennonites received constitutional parity with Catholic believers, while Jews received religious protections in private worship and special status, if not full citizenship, within the Bavarian state. Added to that, we have the secularization and the expropriation of church property and the state's demonization of monasteries as mere superstitious institutions. It's the same actually what happened in Austria under Joseph II. Anything that was not seen as useful economically or conducive towards state aims was mainly seen as superfluous, having all of these able-bodied men who could essentially be used for more industrious purposes. You know, in the era of mass statism and conscription, such institutions, which are focused basically on the contemplative life of God, cannot be considered. With all of this going on, the papacy, which had basically been renewed after Napoleon's fall under Pius VII, accused the Bavarian state of treachery, given that it had just reached a religious concordat. Given what I mentioned at the beginning, Cavaliero's little description on sort of Rhaetia or Bavaria south of the Danube, you can say that not only was Montgelas reconfiguring the territories of Bavaria and expanding Wittelsbach influence into the north, but he was fundamentally declaring war on the cultural identity of the South Danube Bavaria. But this is Montgelas himself, taken from his memoirs. From the outbreak of the French Revolution, 2 parties grew up at the small Zweibrücken court, that referring to Maximilian's little court. The first continued to believe in the old ways and disliked France. The other paid homage to liberal ideas, sympathized with France, and held that one could deal with the Republic without endangering throne and altar. This during the decade after the French Revolution, before Maximilian became king. The latter party grew in number and influence when military victories came to the aid of ideals previously damned, the victories of Napoleon. By 1808, the year of Bavaria's first constitution, the conservatives seemed emasculated, but the following year they reasserted themselves, remaining from then on in hindrance to effective government. This bitter conflict smoldered over the years, though the opposition was afraid to act decisively so long as Napoleon's success held. However, as the French Empire crumbled, bringing a general change in political orientation, the time seemed ripe to depose of the man Montgelas who led Bavaria during the period of French hegemony, no matter how fruitful his administration had been. So basically, from the point of view of Montgelas, he sees himself as nothing more than the victim of a reactionary clique and associated with a broken French policy. But as we also see, it was very clear that Montgelas created a policy which assured Bavaria sufficient autonomy and self-interest in order for it to change sides at the right time in order to gain vast amounts of territory in compensation for anticipated losses towards Austria. When looking at the fall of Montgelas, it sort of coincides with the ascendancy of the Crown Prince, later Ludwig I. And really, you can say the fall of Montgelas represents the loss of King Maximilian's rock, kind of like what we see with Wilhelm I, the first Prussian emperor of Germany. Maximilian was a fundamentally, you can say, weak character who relied to far greater extent on his private secretary and then his first minister, who had effectively shaped his entire reign up until that point for 20 years, as we see with Leonard von Eck and his guiding hand over the policy of William IV. So we have the bizarre situation where, following Montgelas's fall, we have the creation of a new constitution. We had the 1808 constitution, which was Montgelas's creation. And in 1818, we have a new, quote unquote, democratic constitution. Montgelas's solution towards government had always been that of enlightened despotism. He wanted to expand the power of Bavaria and the Bavarian dynasty, the Wittelsbachs, into acquiring new territories, but he wasn't at all interested in terms of allowing for greater participation in government, which wasn't simply that of meritocratic establishment in the civil service. He was very Napoleonic in his conception of the state. And in many ways, Montgelas can be seen as the last of the enlightened despots. Against this, there was the aspirations for a more democratic regime in Bavaria. If you look at the fact that Bavaria has gained so much territory in the north, the whole idea of appealing to democracy was seen as a stopgap solution to bring more people into belief in the new Bavarian government, i.e. taking over territories like Nuremberg and Aschaffenburg and making them loyal to the capital, Munich. It was also seen as a preemptive move, actually, to win over people in Baden for the expected ascension of Baden into Bavaria, becoming united through the Palatinate into one continuous territory. So the fact that Bavaria was thwarted of its desire to gain even a partition in Baden actually meant that the democratic solution proved disastrous in the short term, because any would-be gains by appealing to democracy and liberalism ended very badly. You can almost say that what Bavaria was doing was actually what Bismarck would later do, a proto-Bismarckian policy. Bismarck, in appealing to Prussian leadership over the German states, was appealing to German popular sentiment and a new creation of a Reichstag of the North German Confederation. The idea of giving everyone in Germany a vote was basically a means of preventing Austria, which was multinational, from having any influence over German unification, because it would require too radical a reform of what was then a far more, you can say, particularistic and heterogeneous empire compared to Prussia. So what we see, you can say, of the origin of appealing directly to the people in order to justify political and administrative expansion in southern Germany was tried by Maximilian in 1818, albeit it failed. It's also rather remarkable in the sense that this Bavarian liberalism, this democratic turn in Bavaria, was completely contrasted vis-a-vis what was going on in the rest of Germany and indeed the rest of Europe, which, following from the policies of the Austrian minister-president and foreign minister von Metternich, had just passed through the Karlsbad decrees, which were a series of repressive and censorious measures aimed at basically ensuring the supremacy of monarchy of the right. And by that I mean effectively, if not divine right, then dynastic right, such as propping up the restoration of the Bourbons in France, and the King of Naples and Sicily, and the King of Spain. Contrasted to that, Bavaria seemed to be pursuing a completely opposite course, and right at the heart of the new German Confederation and right next to Austria. So when the new parliament was opened per this new constitution, it basically precipitated a German crisis. Many of the parliamentarians, inspired by the French Revolution, wanted the king to sign an oath on the constitution, essentially rendering the whole idea that Bavaria is a dynastic state mute. This precipitated a German federal crisis. There was nearly a German federal intervention, like what we saw with Sicily and Spain. And so Maximilian was faced with either a parliamentary coup of the quote unquote democratic parties removing him from below, or a Prussian Austrian invasion, which would also amount to a coup, which would basically remove any sort of influence he had over the government. He managed to avoid both fates and would spend the rest of his reign as one of those rare instances of a constitutional monarch in the era of Carlsbad. What did begin was, in foreign policy, a Bavarian posture of leadership over the smaller states in the German Confederation thereafter. But when it comes to the reign of Ludwig, we have something which resembles something far more absolutist and perhaps something even more recognizable. If you look at the little reign dates on my PowerPoint slide, this is just a personal thing for me, a little taboo. I hated the fact that when you had newly created empires and kingdoms in the 19th century, they reset their regnal numbers. For some reason, it's always really frustrated me. So I've included both the modern regnal numbers and the continuous regnal numbers. So Ludwig I of Bavaria is actually Ludwig XI of Bavaria, if you're counting this all the way to Ludwig, who became ruler of Bavaria in 1183. I think that's only fair in terms of giving old medieval Ludwig his dues. In terms of a description of Frederick, I have a short segment from Cavaliero again. Ludwig ascended the throne in 1825. He was 39 years old, born in 1786 when his father was a French officer, and he had been a godson of the ill-fated Louis XVI, whose name he took. As heir apparent to the Bavarian throne, he had been unwittingly obliged to participate in Napoleon's war with Austria at Wagram, and Ludwig's was a powerful voice in persuading his father to change sides and join the alliance that followed Napoleon's Russian debacle. Now that he was king, he was able to put the clock back to an ideal world that existed before the Great Revolution. Even so, he was not a complete reactionary. Bavaria needed to generate wealth, and Ludwig did not stand in the way of industrialization, digging a canal between the Danube and the Main rivers to facilitate transport and building a railway as far as Nuremberg. Given the fact that Nuremberg and Munich are basically the economic hearts, you would expect that to be the very minimum in terms of economic investment in that era, but, hey-ho. But that was as far as his modernity went. Ludwig looked back, following the intellectual fashion of the day, to an age of unimagined German glory in the Middle Ages. He restored some of the suppressed monasteries and gave himself royal and even imperial titles. He revived in himself the Wittelsbach line that had formerly expired when Charles Theodore succeeded to the electorate, by that meaning the senior line, the line that carried on from Emperor Ludwig the Bavarian. Above all, he threw himself into buildings, into collecting art, and into writing poetry. His passion for all things Hellenic made him an enthusiastic supporter of Greek independence, and in 1832, his son Otto was persuaded to become the first king of an independent Greece. I've already alluded to at the beginning how disastrously that went. He amassed Greek and Roman sculpture for his classically designed museums, and in addition to altering the largely medieval face of Munich, he sent his architects to help his son give his capital Athens a suitably neoclassical appearance. He even decreed that his country should be called Bayern, using the Hellenic upsilon instead of the Latin letter I. Above all, he had a wholly neoclassical fondness for classical beauties, whom he immortalized in his Gallery of Beauties, and though he was hard of hearing and married with 8 children, he took whom of them he could to bed. For a short time, he was a lover of the society beauty and heiress Jane Digby, who left him for another Bavarian nobleman who was father to a son, but he entered into a more enduring relationship, largely for ill, with a notorious Irish horizontale, Lola Montez, who was originally christened Eliza Rosanna Gilbert. Lola Montez was born in Ireland in 1821, child of the 15-year-old wife of Edward Gilbert, ensign in a regiment destined for India, who died of cholera shortly after arriving there. Eliza's mother quickly married another ensign, and the young Eliza grew up in a paradise for children. Wayward and spoiled, sent home to England for education, she grew in wilderness and in beauty, mistaken for a child of mixed blood and acquiring enough learning to wish for no more. To get back to India, she eloped at 16 with Lieutenant James when she abandoned by mutual consent in Calcutta to become a dancer. Both in London again, she assumed a Spanish identity as Lola Montez, dancing wild and faintly lubricous sarabands and seguidillas until rumbled as fraudulently non-Spanish, whereupon she left for the continent to make her name there as a fiery and self-willed but undeniable beauty, performing her Iberian art wherever she could. It's very interesting how actually that whole backstory follows a similar line with Catherine Legrand, another English Frenchified mistress of one Jean-Maurice de Talleyrand. In Paris, Lola managed to captivate Franz Liszt, who introduced her to his former lover, the great-granddaughter of the Saxon condottiere Maurice de Saxe. In the salon of Georges Sand, Lola developed some social, if raffish, literary arts that introduced her to the seraglio of Alexandre Dumas. Thence, in 1846, on the death of her lover of the day, she went to Munich, where it was not difficult to catch the eye of the septuagenarian king. It was probably malicious gossip that she did this by baring her breasts to show him that she was really that well endowed, and progression to royal mistress was quick thereafter. Soon a reincarnated Lagraventz stalked the corridors of Munich. The Munchers were not averse to their monarch's choice of two foreigners as his maîtresses en titres, official mistresses, but both remarkably lovely in their way. But Jane Digby had the sense not to stay around and interfere. Lola was by contrast incautious and greedy. The Munchers soon realized that she was not good either for Ludwig or for Bavaria, and when they learned that in addition to all the houses, jewels, and works of art that Ludwig lavished on her, she wanted a title and acceptance as a naturalized Bavarian citizen, and as she used to boast, that what Lola gets, Lola wants, Lola gets. Ludwig was tiring of being constitutional monarch. He had already secured a clerically conservative ministry that was, under the influence of the restored Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, inexorably rescinding the liberal laws that had allowed freedom of conscience in the press. It was becoming dangerous to voice criticism of the royal family or affairs of state, which seemed to be controlled by Montez. When the chief minister of a subservient but clerical administration sent a memorandum to the king, expressing reservations about naturalizing Lola, making her a Bavarian citizen, she had him dismissed. She secured her title as one Countess of Landsfeld, and the new ministry accorded her naturalization papers. But trouble was brewing. The parody of the Lord's Prayer beseeching God to give Lola her daily prerequisites of house and home, to forgive her excesses and lead her not into penury, echoed what had been prayed about Lagraventz in Württemberg during the last century. That, for reference, is another interesting episode in German history, but I don't have the liberty really to talk about it without going onto a gross tangent. Lola seemed quite insensitive to criticism, foiled every attempt of the new chief minister to form an administration. When protests convulsed at the university, Ludwig dismissed its protesters, arrested their students, and suspended the constitution. What was put in place of the dissolved assembly was dubbed the Ministry of Lola, the Lola Ministerium, but it was in March of 1848 that the virus of revolution was abroad in Europe. When Ludwig dismissed the Lola ministry but not Lola, the normally complacent Munchers exploded in rage. Both Ludwig and his Lehmann had to go, and go they went, Lola to Switzerland, hoping to be joined by Ludwig, who abdicated in favour of his son, another Maximilian. It should be mentioned, the reason again place so much emphasis on Lola Montez, not only would it come up the so-called curse of Lola Montez in other instances, but it is one of these sort of great events in Bavarian history where if there was going to be a serious restoration, towards a more, you can say, traditional Bavarian government, which is an absolute monarch aligning with the Jesuits and the Catholic Church. All of this is being undergirded by devotion to an Irish harlot. Perhaps had it not been for the fact that Louis Philippe in France had been deposed a month earlier, and the fact that even Metternich would also fall in the same month. That's why in German and Austrian history, so much of the Biedermeier period is actually called Vormärz, before the revolutions of March. It's possible under any other circumstance he could have survived, as Louis XV indeed survived indulging his affair with Madame de Pompadour, but Frederick could not. And perhaps again, he was reacting so hard against the policies of Montgelas, ensuring too many enemies, that again, a perfect storm of events led to a situation in which Ludwig was deposed. But Ludwig would not only sort of live on, he would actually outlive his son, who became King Maximilian II, who, again, in opposition to his father, was actually quite a prudent ruler of Bavaria. So first of all, Maximilian had to deal with the fact that the revolution had attempted to create a united Germany. They had formed an assembly in Frankfurt, which evolved later into a Frankfurt Parliament. Maximilian opposed this. There was a revolution in the Bavarian Palatinate, which Maximilian put down. He supported the Austrian minister von Schwarzenberg and the new Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph. In the punctuation of Olmütz, Schwarzenberg and Maximilian essentially ended Prussia's attempt at creating a new German union, excluding Austria, what was known as the Erfurt Union, what would later perhaps be a forerunner to the North German Confederation. And thus Maximilian was able to secure not only royal rule, but to restore Bavaria's position within Germany. And Maximilian's anti-Prussian policy culminated in the Princes' Assembly, the Fürstenrat of 1863, which was a failed attempt at German unification under Austria, which was boycotted by Prussia, basically ensuring its failure. Maximilian pursued a middle, though autocratic, course between German nationalism, more sort of left-wing politicians, albeit this is really the era before mainstream social democrats, and ultramontanism, that being complete adherence and deference to the Pope, at least in matters spiritual, but with the underpinning essentially that one would follow the Pope in politics as well. And this was done under the influence of one Franz Xaver von Schonwirth, a German polymath and folklorist. Following in the tradition of Montgelas, and indeed his namesake, his grandfather, Maximilian I, Maximilian established the foundations for the Maximilianeum, which was an elite college for aspiring civil servants that you can see today. It's now the building for the Bavarian State Parliament. But he dies unexpectedly in 1864, leading to his 18-year-old son, Ludwig, becoming king. As you will know if you watch my video on Ludwig II, Ludwig is far more sort of renowned and consequential for his cultural feats. I mean, I started this video in reference to Neuschwanstein. And of course, one of the first things Ludwig does is try to call for Richard Wagner, who, for people who don't know because they're living under a rock, was one of the greatest, if not the most famous, German composer to ever live. In particular, Ludwig had memorized many of the librettos or the poems of Wagner, the literary renditions of the operas. He became obsessed with Lohengrin and the idea of the Swan Knight, and he wanted to patronize Wagner and situate Wagner within Munich, and indeed, possibly, not only elevate Munich's prestige for association with Wagner, but use Munich essentially as a vehicle towards German cultural unification. You can say that this policy actually began with his grandfather, Ludwig I, whereas I'm going to be pedantic in saying Ludwig XI, because not only was Ludwig pursuing a pro-Catholic policy and a pro-absolutist policy, but as with such a focus on neoclassicism, he was also responsible for the construction of the quote-unquote Bavarian Valhalla, a great monument not only to Bavarian neoclassicism, but the quote-unquote heroes of Bavarian culture and history. Part of the idea was that Frederick again was trying to make Munich into the unquestioned cultural capital of Germany. Ludwig would continue in that legacy by patronizing and ensuring the premiere of the work of Tristan and Isolde by Wagner, which was essentially considered unperformable. And then he would later on patronize the first performance of Die Meistersingers von Nuremberg, which again, if anything, helped stabilize Bavarian identity given the Munich-Nuremberg connection, which had been reformed by Montgelas. But bringing up the whole situation with Lola Montez, Wagner was seen as a terrible influence on the king. Wagner, to be quite frank, was an enfant terrible. He was incredibly scandalous when it came to soliciting funds. He was having an affair at the time with the wife of his his conductor, Hans von Bülow, Cosima Liszt, who so happened to be the daughter of Franz Liszt, and essentially requested that the king officially deny the rumors, which meant essentially that the king was formally privy to a lie, which further scandalized his reputation. All of this perhaps led to the rightful conclusion that Wagner, despite again being a man and a composer, was nothing other than a second Lola Montez and would bring down the monarchy. So he was banished from Munich, despite the premiere of Tristan and Isolde, and was given a Swiss refuge at Lucerne, which was actually paid for by Ludwig. But it's during this time that we have the Austro-Prussian War, one of the most significant moments in German history. Essentially, Prussia was now consolidating under a new minister, Bismarck, who would lead the unification of Germany. Part of the impetus for that war was excluding Austria from the German Confederation. If Austria were excluded, then the rest of the German princes would be unable to resist unification under Prussia, and that, of course, included Bavaria. Bavaria, therefore, naturally, following the policy of Maximilian, who he pursued at the punctuation of Olmütz, sided with Austria. The ministers, that is, ministers like Vorden and Fiftemeister. But Ludwig decided to escape and attempt to abdicate and present himself as a copyist of Wagner. And that didn't go down very well. The Bavarians, when they did fight, they lost a minor battle and they had to cede a tiny amount of territory. But ultimately, Bismarck was very generous to the Bavarians because Bismarck almost uniquely understood all the advantages that would accrue from a relationship with a figure like Ludwig. And such a relationship would actually result in the Kaiserbrief. I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation how if you look at Neuschwanstein as a uniquely Bavarian monument, you have to understand that indirectly the construction of Neuschwanstein and Ludwig's desperate need for funds led to the creation of the German Empire. Well, Ludwig, of course, was responsible for the Kaiserbrief, imploring the King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, to receive the position of Emperor of German Emperor. The idea from Bismarck was if the King of Bavaria, the most powerful of all of the little German princes, implored the the Prussian king to become German Emperor, then it would basically be seen as a votive offering of the electors of the old Holy Roman Empire and not a democratic imposition, as it had been of the Frankfurt Parliament in 1848 and 1849. For his cause, Ludwig II was convinced that he would not be a submissive partner in this. He was convinced that this was simply a new restoration of a Holy Roman Empire, a second Holy Roman Empire. There was even the prospect, Ludwig believed, in terms of negotiating the Kaiserbrief, that the whole constitutional makeup of the new German Empire would not have a hereditary Kaiser. He instead wanted the idea of an alternating Kaisership, which would go Prussia and then Bavaria, which would mean, assuming Wilhelm would die because he was so old, that Ludwig would actually be next in line to be Kaiser. And for all this, Ludwig acceded to fighting a war against Bavaria's, you can say, longtime ally France, on the side of Prussia. The only thing that would really have prevented this from happening was if Bavaria had taken, along with Austria, a more strident stance to quash Prussian expansionism and form an alliance with France. However, that was very unlikely to happen because France's demands were too high. The Emperor of France at the time, Napoleon III, wanted the left bank of the Rhine. He wanted the Palatinate territory of Bavaria. And what Bismarck was basically suggesting was, yes, Bavaria would be a junior partner to Prussia, but Bavaria's territorial integrity would remain intact. So Ludwig, for all of the aforementioned reasons above, partly it should be mentioned due to events beyond his control, but also you can say as a result of his spiraling inclination to become the culture king, investing all of his money, his efforts, his creative imagination into his castles, opted essentially to become a vassal sovereign, thus ending the phase of the independent kingdom of Bavaria between the French Confederation of the Rhine and now the new German Empire. And German Austria it has remained ever since. When Ludwig was king under Prussia, Ludwig actually pursued many of the same policies that Bismarck pursued against Catholic politics. Prussia under Bismarck wanted to suppress Catholic regional politics, such as parliamentary representation, the Centre Party, Catholics being associated with Poles, which would basically mean Polish agitation against Germanification in the East, but also of the Catholic association with the Rhinelanders in Western Prussia and the area around the Ruhr. So Bismarck was very focused on stamping out potential Catholic action, believing essentially that there was an international conspiracy to ruin Germany, the Black International, the International of the Cassock. And Ludwig actually went along with this. Ludwig actually reverted back to pursuing a Montgelas-esque policy. He resuppressed the Jesuits, he overturned his grandfather's legacy, and he became a convinced anti-ultramontanist. He opposed the First Vatican Council and Vatican I and the Declaration of Papal Infallibility, and he pursued alongside Bismarck the Kulturkampf, which actually, along with all the other reasons, made Ludwig a compelling ally of Bismarck, which is probably why Bismarck again tolerated him for so long. But whatever sort of policy and political action Ludwig could effect was again crippled by his increasing isolation and his focus on the construction of palaces like Linderhof and Herrenchiemsee and other more fantastical operations to establish a Moorish palace and a Chinese pavilion and new castles dotted throughout the Bavarian Tyrol and the Bavarian Alps in general. So a conspiracy is finally launched to declare the unmarried Ludwig insane. The final verdict of the professor who denounces him is of paranoia, which effectively today would perhaps be rendered as schizophrenia, Professor Gotten. All of this had the whiff of a palace coup. The main beneficiary of this was going to be his uncle, Ludwig's uncle Leopold. The main instigator of this plot was von Lutz, the cabinet secretary. The Bavarian ministry was concerned with the king's reckless financials, with reckless spending, the imminent bankruptcy of the crown, and the king's complete sort of absence of any desire to assume a constitutional or ceremonial function, instead retreating into his isolation. So for all of these reasons, a noted sort of conspiracy arose in the Bavarian political system, and indeed in the Wittelsbach family, to depose Ludwig. So when he was declared insane and deposed, and later he would commit suicide and through a series of conspiracies, either be responsible for the death of his psychiatrist in Lake Starnberg, or more plausibly, his psychiatrist waited in after him to prevent him committing suicide and dies of a heart attack. Whatever interpretations, there are boundless theories as to what actually happened to Ludwig. The reason it has sort of had such a sort of stain of scandal ever since is because they took a ruler who was declared insane in absentia, and they replaced him with his brother, who was certifiably insane and never seemed to understand during the 20 years, 30 years in which he was king of Bavaria, that he was, in fact, king of Bavaria. The only crisis which is really comparable to what happened to Ludwig, quote unquote, Mad King Ludwig, is what happened in Mayerling a few years later, when you had the murder-suicide of the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary, Crown Prince Rudolf. So with Ludwig gone, the last real sort of Wittelsbach king is gone. And what remains of the Wittelsbach are very much the constitutional ornaments and lesser iterations. Leopold, you can see the uncle who, again, never was able to survive the association of him being partly responsible for Ludwig's deposition, let alone death, essentially went into the background, and we see the slow emergence of parliamentarianism finally in Bavaria. In 1891, Rerum Novarum is published. Part of Ludwig's policy, of course, had been pursuing the Kulturkampf, but with Leopold as regent of Bavaria over the mad King Otto, Catholic politics reached a new ascendancy, and the more sort of stringent anti-Catholic policies of Ludwig, anti-Catholic in the sense of being anti-papist, were reversed. You see the emergence of the Bavarian Centre Party, in particular one Georg von Hertling, who would later become German Chancellor, as leading the cause for Catholic Bavarian parliamentarianism. You would also see other political movements like the Bavarian Peasants' Party, with a distinct sort of anti-clerical tinge, perhaps continuing on the legacy of Ludwig. And then this would all evolve into what we have in Weimar, Bavaria, which is the BVP, or the Bavarian People's Party, which will be led by von Kahr, who is known mostly to history due to his role in the beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923. So Leopold more or less fades into the background, and he dies as a regent for his insane nephew in 1912, and he is replaced for 1 year by Ludwig before he contrives a way of becoming king in his own right. Ludwig's interesting in the sense that the would-be Ludwig III attempted to enter parliament as a normal elected MP. In 1906, he formed a broad coalition with the Social Democrats. In fact, his support of expanding the franchise and creating more of a constitutional democracy in Bavaria was such that August Babel, one of the founders of the SPD in Germany, actually complimented the new German prince. The German people, if the Kaiser were to be chosen from one of the German princes, would presumably elect the Wittelsbach Ludwig and not Prussia's Wilhelm. Finally, in 1913, Ludwig deposed of Otto, but when he did so, it wasn't through a clandestine internal palace coup and a declaration of insanity which had gotten rid of Ludwig II. It was via a popular constitutional amendment under the direction of the popular Prime Minister von Hertling. And this was essentially seen as the definitive switch of Bavaria to a constitutional monarchy from what had lingered on as the residue of an absolutist system, as had been Montgelas's original interpretation. What is interesting about Ludwig is that his reign is more or less dominated by the First World War, but despite that, he, on the one hand, had to resist designs against him being seen as nothing more than a Prussian, and by extension a German lackey. What really complicated this view is that von Hertling, having been Prime Minister of Bavaria, was made the Chancellor of Germany in 1970, And not only the Chancellor of Germany, but von Hertling was seen as nothing more than a puppet for Hindenburg and Ludendorff and the military high command's control over essentially a military dictatorship in Germany. Such had a devastating effect, you can say, on the popularity of the Catholic Centre Party in Bavaria and the king's own reputation. But despite that, the king still believed that Bavaria could gain territories of its own in the event of victory during the war. So Germany occupied Belgium throughout much of the war, and Ludwig even desired that Bavaria acquire conquests in Belgium, restoring Charles Theodor's partition plans a century earlier. In particular, he wanted a Bavarian port into the North Sea, Ostend or Antwerp were suggested as various ports that that Bavaria could acquire at the expense of Belgium, but it's very unlikely that this would have ever been achieved. And of course, Germany was defeated in the war. On the cusp of defeat, so in the weeks leading up to the armistice on November the 11th, 1918, Kurt Eisner began to lead protests on the first anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. These protests were joined by the Independent Socialist Party, which is effectively the more Marxist-aligned, the more radical iteration of the SPD, who regardless still joined the protests against the monarchy. And the protests were also joined by the Bavarian Peasants' League or party and various trade unions. Together, all of these, you can say, anti-Catholic Centre Party and anti-monarchist forces organized a coup in Munich, declaring the People's State of Bavaria. It should be mentioned that this was an urban-led coup. It was a very unpopular coup, which was attested to by the disastrous results of Kurt Eisner and the parties in the election in the following months. But Ludwig fled, and that made him, on the 7th of November 1918, the first of the German princes of the Holy Roman Empire to be deposed. But he didn't formally abdicate. He instead created the Arnulf Declaration, which, like we saw with Karl of Austria, it was a renunciation of affairs in politics and relieving people of the duties of their oaths, in particular the oaths of the army, but with the assumption that if the time was right, that there would be a restoration of the Wittelsbach family going forward. The People's Republic of Bavaria, the pseudo-Marxist government, which was under Kurt Eisner, was brutally put down. And when Ludwig finally died in 1921, his son, the Crown Prince Ruprecht, placed his claim to the throne front and center. So there was still the prospect in the 1920s and 30s that the Wittelsbach could be restored in some iteration. When it came to 1923, it was Ruprecht and Kahr that effectively, you can say, stymied much of the potential support going towards the Nazis and Hitler in the beer hall putsch. In particular, Ruprecht was loath to support any organization which had the backing of Ludendorff, who, of course, was the Prussian military, I'm not going to say necessarily dictator, but strongman and director of the war in the last 2 years, 1917, 1918. So there was a very strong anti-Prussian and by extension anti-Prussian-led German contingent in Bavaria that persisted. But regardless, by 1932, you have Heinrich Brüning's end of the period of his chancellorship, President Hindenburg ruling by decree, and a lot of maneuvering in order to change the German constitution. You had the Preußenschlacht, the Prussian coup by Franz von Papen, which basically was intended as a stepping stone for the restoration of the Hohenzollerns, but ultimately that was outmaneuvered by Hitler and Goering. But a similar momentum was afoot to restore the monarchy in Bavaria. Originally, it was actually to create Ruprecht with a new title, not as king, but as Staatskommissar, in the same way that Prussia was recreated as a commissariat, a Reichskommissariat, with the assumption essentially that that would be a intermediary stage for the restoration of the monarchy. But any such serious political maneuvering to ensure that Wittelsbach was placed as head of state of Bavaria was frustrated by the, you can say, vacillation of Heinrich Held, the long-standing state president of Bavaria. And Heinrich Held's lack of political resolve did him no wonders. He was arrested and sent to Dachau concentration camp for his anti-Hitlerian stance, but of course, partly as a result of his lack of firm determination in creating an alternative to the National Socialists by propping up a Wittelsbach, and perhaps even leading to, if not a restoration of the Bavarian monarchy, then perhaps even Bavarian independence vis-a-vis the Nazis. But nevertheless, during the Third Reich, we have the creation of the Reichsgau, overlapping the old administrative regions and kingdoms, dynastic polities of Germany, including Prussia. The attempt essentially was to eliminate the old dynastic rivalries and further consolidate a new unitary German identity. But when National Socialist Germany fell, Prussia did not survive, Germany was partitioned, and you still had the question of Bavaria. And ultimately, when you had the military occupation zones between the British, the French, and the Americans in the West, the American occupation zone more or less resembled Bavaria, with also the addition of Bremen. And this, among many other factors, led to the impetus for a recreation of the Free State of Bavaria. In other words, Bavaria was able to survive as a Länder today, which virtually no other German state has been able to achieve. And I'm going to finish this conversation by reading a segment from Graham Ford's Constructing a Regional Identity. This in particular is focused on how the Christian Social Union became the effective one-party or hegemonic official party of Bavaria since its reconsolidation. The modern Bavarian state is essentially a product of late 18th and early 19th century power politics, so much that it can be considered a French creation. I've already again gone into the reasons why I don't believe that's the case, but you can understand again why some people would necessarily reach that conclusion. You know, when that statement was said, we're talking about in inverted commas, such a notion has basically been ubiquitous, that derisively the Bavarian borders were nothing more than the creation of a Napoleonic contrivance. But as we actually see, Franconia was given over to Bavaria because the French lost, not because the French won. CSU leaders were, however, sensitive to any suggestion that Bavaria was an artificial entity. For example, Richard Jaeger, the vice chairman of the CSU regional group in the Bundestag, wrote that one could dismiss Bavaria as an arbitrary Napoleonic creation. Instead, a teleological narrative of belonging was advanced to explain Bavaria's annexation of its new Swabian and Franconian territories, a narrative which explicitly rejected a simple linear continuity between old Bavaria and modern Bavaria. Again, this with the overall effect of ensuring that Bavaria retained the borders which it has today. Hans Erhard was therefore able to tell an audience of Nuremberg, a predominantly Protestant city in central Franconia, and one that really only definitively came over to Bavaria in the 19th century, that modern Bavaria was not the result of violence and war, but rather, as the time was ripe for the formation of new states, of the natural joining together of those that belonged together. By choosing to forget, in quotes, the violence and brutality that accompanied Bavaria's enlargement, Erhard was able to portray this process as a marriage between old Bavaria and its new Franconian possessions. Indeed, ignoring the Napoleonic Wars, you have to bear in mind the fact that after Bavaria switched sides, the award of these new territories and compensation was done diplomatically. It wasn't done through violence. I wouldn't go so far again as to romantically see it as a marriage rather than a love marriage, rather than a marriage of convenience, if nothing else. Bavaria had to be compensated for the loss of the Tyrol, so it gained Franconia, but nevertheless, this territory wasn't gained through conquest. Erhard understood the Bavarian people in a similarly inclusive manner. Since the mid-19th century, the Bavarian people, the Staatsvolk, had been constructed as a mid-19th century. The Bavarian people, had been constructed as a mid-union of 4 different tribes: the Old Bavarians, the Franconians, the Swabians, and the Palatines, also the Rhinelanders. But, as Hans Eddard argued, it was only together, as a Bavarian people, that they were able to give that state meaning. Such inclusivity was also applied to Bavaria's principal foundation myth, the claim in the preamble to the 1946 state constitution to the more than 1,000-year history of the Bavarian people. This phrase originally alluded to the Bajuwaren, the supposed antecedents of the old Bavarians, whose existence was first recorded several decades after the withdrawal of the Romans from southern Germany. In particular, it was generally understood to refer to the establishment of the Stem Duchy, the tribal duchy of Bavaria under Garibaldi I in the 6th century. Ulrich Stuhl is a representative of most historical opinion when she writes of the preamble. This reference was not historically accurate, as it equated the history of Bavaria with the history of Old Bavaria. However, the term Bavarian people was suitably ambiguous to allow for a more expansive reading. What they mean by the history of Old Bavaria, again, it's looking at this as a teleology, where you see the cultural nation, the Raetia, as I explained in the beginning, the region south of the Danube, as leading to a situation where you have the marriage between Franconia and the Protestant subjects in the north. How effectively, if we're going to look at that, the derisive look at this is to say this is all a French contrivance. I won't argue that. I would say it's a dynastic contrivance. Hence why the Wittelsbachs are so important, and how you can't separate Bavarian history from the Wittelsbachs. The term Bavarian people was suitably ambiguous to allow for a more expansive reading. Against the backdrop of post-war inter-Bavarian tensions, Ernst Doyerlein, at the time of Erhard's principal speechwriter and later an academic historian, claimed that when the new Bavarian constitution refers to the 1,000-year history of Bavaria, it calls to mind the 4 subregions of Old Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and the Palatinate, and articles in the Bayern Courier providing the region's cities provided historical substance for this view for Regensburg, Augsburg, Kempten, both in Swabia, and for this view for Regensburg, Old Bavaria. Rottenburg, Obdetalbe, Franconia were more than 1,000 years old. Kempten in particular is one of these old ancient monastic hubs, which goes back to the Bavarian Middle Ages. And of course, as I've already referenced with Augsburg, it's a Roman city. Modern Bavaria, as conceptualized by CSU politicians, was not then to be confused with Old Bavaria. And again, the terminology used by Graham, Old Bavaria, I'm sort of looking at it as South Danube or sort of Neo-Rhaetia, the cultural nation, as opposed to the dynastic construction of Montgelas and Maximilian post-Napoleonic Empire. It was instead to be understood as a synthesis of the different tribes and traditions that had come together under the auspices of the Wittelsbachs to form the modern Bavarian state in the early 19th century. In this respect, Bavaria's historical diversity could be construed as a common heritage for modern Bavarians. As such, for Erhard and Siedel's Bavaria, political character, epitomized by the commitments to federalism, stemmed from the synthesis of 2 political traditions, the state consciousness of Old Bavaria and the Reich consciousness of Franconia and Swabia. The Reich in this case being the Holy Roman Empire. Hence, Bavaria's historic statehood was rooted in Old Bavaria's state tradition, a particular staple of Catholic regionalists, while Bavaria's commitment to Germany was exemplified by the former imperial territories of modern states, Franconia and the Swabian subregions, a notion likely to resonate with Protestants of all political persuasions, but especially of liberals and conservative nationalists. So again, it's interesting that when we look at 20th century reactionary or conservative ideas about the enduring relevance of modern Bavaria regarding to the Wittelsbach dynastic construction in the 19th century, that federalism and the Germanness of the state is justified by the existence of Franconia and Protestant areas like Nuremberg, but not in the sense that this is a new sort of democratic republican Germany, but because it actually refers to the old imperial Germany. The Wittelsbach have a tradition which is again uniquely wedded to 1,000 years of, again, Germanic unity, for lack of a better expression, but part of the Universal Empire. It's fascinating in many ways to see that if you look at sort of Bavaria and sort of Bavarian national consciousness and sort of political history, memory, it seems to be almost dependent on this more reactionary interpretation compared to what we see in the rest of Germany. So Franconia is Bavarian because it is imperial, because the Wittelsbach are an imperial dynasty, and thereby Bavaria belongs in a federation with the other German states. Yet at the same time, at the core of this is the identity of the cultural nation of quote unquote old Bavaria, south of the Danube, which can have its own distinct tradition and its own state of separateness from the rest of Germany. The articulation of this state tradition was bound up with the monarchy, the Wittelsbachs. The genesis of the Bavarian state was identified with Regensburg, the expulsion of the Romans. It became the ducal seat of the Agilolfings, the dynasty to which Garibaldi belonged. This allowed Seidel to claim that the Old Bavarians were the first German tribe to possess a capital, thus emphasizing the preeminence of Bavarian statehood among Western German region states. It's again interesting that they're looking for dynastic precedents for a capital city or a court city. But it was with the House of Wittelsbach, which reigned between 1180 to 1918, that Bavarian subsequent history was more closely associated. Historical sites connected with the Wittelsbachs functioned as more modern reaffirmations of Bavarian statehood. In particular, given the partitions of Bavaria in the 13th and 14th century, 4 cities had at one time been ducal seats: Straubing, Ingolstadt, Landshut, and Munich. Again, fascinating that each of these cities is to be commended by the fact that they represented individual Wittelsbach capitals as part of the partitions, which again surely must represent the nadir of the dynasty, but here they are being celebrated. Apart from Munich, the most important of these cities was Landshut. As mentioned, it was probably the partition most likely to have succeeded were it not for the failure of the dynasty and the adroit politicking of Albert the Wise in the beginning of the 16th century. Commemorating its 750th anniversary in 1954, the Bayern Courier noted Landshut's origins were an expression of political will. Landshut was already a settlement at the foot of an old watchtower, and Duke Ludwig I elevated it to a city in 1204. Hence my rather reactionary reading of looking at Ludwig I, King of Bavaria, as Ludwig XI, emphasizing continuity. Subsequently, the new city of Landshut was deliberately developed by Ludwig and his son, Duke Otto II, as the capital of the Duchy of Bavaria. Landshut's golden era was during the 14th and 15th century, during the reigns of the rich. During the entire 15th century, the Wittelsbach dukes of Bavaria Landshut belonged to one of the most influential princely houses in Europe, with all dukes earning the epithet of the rich. The most ostentatious example of this wealth was the wedding that Ludwig IX had for his son and Hedwig, the daughter of the King of Poland, in 1475. This historical reenactment of the marriage, the so-called Landshut royal wedding, was first performed in 1903, was and is therefore a heritage event invested with regional political meaning as a vital modern reaffirmation of Bavarian statehood, this for reference being in the final 2 decades of the Wittelsbach dynasty rule in Bavaria. It could be argued that for the Bayern Courier, the significance of the reenactment did not lie solely with George's marriage to Hedwig, but also with the message it conveyed about the Bavarian state tradition. At one level, the royal wedding was an expression of the Wittelsbach's power and influence within the Holy Roman Empire, evidenced by a guest list headed by Kaiser Frederick III. Hence again, this spilling over into modern German regionalism or confederalism, that Bavaria should remain distinct, yet also part of a greater imperial whole or a Germanic whole. More importantly, the reenactment signaled the symbiotic relationship between monarchy and people, exemplified by Ludwig's generosity in paying for the local townsfolk to celebrate the occasion. This symbolism was further reinforced by the fact that both the Bavarian minister-president and the head of the House of Wittelsbach, Crown Prince Ruprecht, until his death in 1957, then Duke Albrecht, were the joint patrons of the festival. Thus, despite Bavaria having a republican form of government nominally since 1918, Ruprecht and Albrecht continue to assume the monarchy's role as the dignified part of the Bavarian constitution, the personified continuity of Bavarian statehood. And if you look on the image on the right, France has basically decided to assume part of that role. You know, he lives in the Augustinian monastery palace in near the Obersalzberg in Berchtesgaden. He lives in the Nymphenburg Palace. So even though, again, you can almost say that Bavaria is only a pseudo-republic, in a sense, given the cultural deference and the social preeminence that the Wittelsbach have, again, vis-a-vis all of the other German dynasties, I don't believe that relationship really exists, especially not for the Hohenzollerns, who have become, again, from the point of view of historians, the battleground of their relationship with the National Socialists and accusations of anti-Semitism, etc., etc., etc. But that's just one example. Looking at the legacy of Ludwig IX and Landshut, I mean, even look at someone like Ludwig, who I've got featured and is a beast state in his later reign, who is again known as Unser Kini, our king, and yet he's also expressing Bismarckian policies, and he has a pivotal role in German unification. All of these elements again show, from a certain point of view, that Bavaria is to remain very distinct, its own tribal duchy. But again, from the point of view of the justification of Bavarian existence, if Bavaria is to be a kingdom, it has to be seen as a kingdom within a broader confederation, whether that be historically as part of the empire, the Roman Empire, the Carolingian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, or the Kaiserreich, the German Empire. And interestingly, under the Third Reich, its identity would be thoroughly repressed, but it survived and it rebounded. So yes, linking all of this history together is the history of the Wittelsbach, like what we see with the Habsburgs in Austria, a legacy of continuity of statehood and possession that is older than the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs took over Austria following the Battle of Marchfeld, where the enemy, not just of the Habsburgs, but also the Wittelsbach's Ottokar II of Bohemia, was defeated. And the Hohenzollern possession of Brandenburg, which became the forerunner to Brandenburg Prussia, wasn't established until the demise of the Luxembourg influence there, I think in 1415. So by that logic, if you're looking to a precedent for Prussia and a precedent for Austria, Bavaria is older than either. Hence, again, why an argument can be made that the Wittelsbachs, despite being the deferential dynasty, in some ways won in the long term. That in addition to the fact that they have earned the sort of prize for longevity. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Again, I find it interesting to explore the regional identity and Bavarian particularism in particular, and dissecting all of these notions and giving an opportunity to do a quick summary of what turned out to be over 1,000 years of history. Thank you very much for listening. I'll get to your super chats. Now, I know that I received 2 super chats before the stream went on, but I'm certain now that they were posted too early, and so I won't be able to read them. I can remember one of them. I can't remember the first one, so to the person who sent the first super chat, I'm sorry, but I can't remember what you said. The first super chat was by Sapley, thank you very much, who commented on the anecdote about Count Otto attempting to attack the papal legate, and I mentioned that rather explicitly at the beginning when Otto the Redhead was still only the Count of Schweren, and I commented on his zeal for the cause of the Hohenstaufens and how the papal legate was seen to basically denigrate Frederick Barbarossa. yeah, within the sort of wars of the Guelphs and Ghibellines is one of the more dramatic moments, and probably again the first moment where the Wittelsbach sort of arise out of historical obscurity. Fred Varley, MM7JT for £15. Thank you very much. Thank you for your work, AM. Your depth and breadth of knowledge is truly inspiring. Read the stream. Could early modern Bavaria be compared to the Dukes of Burgundy, i.e. Maximilian I and Philip IV? It's what I mean. Burgundy and Bavaria are in the interesting situation where they, well, first of all, they could have become separate kingdoms, medieval kingdoms in their own right. Burgundy was a Holy Roman kingdom. It was also Lotharingia or Lorraine. There were concerted attempts by Charles the Bold to make Burgundy in the 1470s its own kingdom, and he failed dramatically. Whereas in Bavaria, as we see, there were various instances to make Bavaria a kingdom, whether it be in the 10th century, whether it be in the 18th century, and ultimately, as we saw successfully, in the 19th century. So that theme of Bavaria obtaining independence and becoming a kingdom in its own right is a recurring theme. And given the fact that Maximilian and Philip the Good of Burgundy were creating, dynastic states, it's certainly an interesting angle to take. And also bear in mind that these histories aren't separate, as we see with Charles Theodore and Maximilian II. The Wittelsbach were desirous to expand their influence, and indeed with Ludwig the Bavarian, who basically created the forerunner for the Burgundian influence in the Low Countries. The Wittelsbach were very interested in this region, and if we were going to take Ludwig III and his independent foreign policy during World War I seriously, it was a desire of the Habsburgs, of the Wittelsbachs, to get into Belgium, to get into the Low Countries, right up until the point of their dissolution. So yes, you can draw various links to Wittelsbachs and the loss of Holland, the loss of Hainaut, the loss of Zeeland and these territories in the Low Countries. It's all very interesting, at least to me. Ambivalent Teacher for $7. Thank you very much. Excellent stream. Tangential question. Do you think a split North Prot Germany, South Calf Germany would have made the 19th, 20th century Europe more stable? Well, that was certainly an idea that was floated. Based on my reading of the creation of the Bavarian Constitution of 1818, that seemed to be the driving force. The idea was that if Baden could essentially be won to the cause of joining Bavaria through a liberal constitution, it would be a case of, vox populi, vox Dei. The people demand it. The people demand a South German confederation. Yes, it would have been seen as congruent with Bavaria's dynastic interests in forming one continuous state, but the logic basically led not just towards the annexation of Baden, but also the annexation of the Kingdom of Württemberg, which would have been completely surrounded by Bavaria if that had occurred. And as I mentioned, if you take that argument seriously, then you have to look at Bavaria vis-a-vis all the other states of Europe as actually trying what Bismarck would later succeed with Germany. So that is certainly a very interesting angle to take. As to whether it would have created a more stable Europe, I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. Obviously, a lot of the stability in Europe relied less on the question of, I would guess, who united Germany, but whether the German enmity with France was created and maintained. And the issue is with the way Germany was unified and the way Germany annexed Alsace and Lorraine, the whole French Third Republic in its first half up until World War I was sustained through hatred of Germany. So I think European stability would have been maintained if a limited German unification didn't have the effect of alienating French territory and French pride. Fred Varley, MM7J2 again, thank you very much. £5. Would a Wittelsbach Spain have been able to effectively counterbalance the Valois Bourbons, should be mentioned at that time? Fred Valery. And Habsburgs, or was Spain already in decline? Thanks again, AM. Well, what a Wittelsbach Spain would have done is it was the only real opportunity for the Spanish monarchy, as you can see on this map, to survive. I don't think there was any scenario in which the entire Spanish inheritance could have gone over to one of the other candidates. I think everything sort of revolved around a partition. Even with a Bavarian candidate, the British still favoured a policy of partition. But yes, a Wittelsbach Spain with Bavaria attached to it could have been in a position to pursue a pro-Habsburg or a pro-Bourbon course. It would have been the great third power in Catholic politics in Europe and indeed the world. And given the strong connection it had with the Jesuits and the papacy, it would have been a natural alliance. Again, possibly, it could have actually, going back to the question you posed to me earlier, it could have actually been a weird sort of Burgundy solution, where you have the third Catholic kingdom trying to effect a peaceful settlement between all the Catholic nations in Europe. Spain, yes, was already in steady decline, but if Spain had held on to all of its European possessions, it would have been far more powerful and far wealthier. Again, it's one of these interesting questions. My point has always been that Maximilian was far more ambitious than all of his other contemporaries who became kings. So he aspired, he was more ambitious and failed far more dramatically than any of them. Jonah J. Verdon Sapley, thank you. Thanks all you do for your great work. Good stream. Well, thank you very much. Right. It's been 3 hours of me prattling, so I'll leave you all there and join you soon. Good night, everyone, and thank you for listening.